Hello, everyone.
Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. Story 1. The thing I hit. That wasn't an animal from Big Diesel Dean. I've been hauling freight across the interstate for near about 17 years now. And in all that time, I've seen just about everything you can imagine on these dark stretches of asphalt that cut through the heartland like scars on old leather. I've seen deer frozen in headlights, possums waddling across double yellows, even a black bear once up in Montana that stood on its hind legs and watched me pass like it was considering whether to hitch a ride. But what I hit that night on Route 52, somewhere between nowhere and nothing in the Nebraska flatlands, that wasn't any animal I've ever seen before or since, and I pray to God I never see again. It was coming up on 3 in the morning, that dead hour when the world feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for something that never quite arrives. I was running behind schedule, pushing hard to make my delivery window in Omaha, and the coffee I'd picked up at the last truck stop had gone cold in my cup holder about an hour back. The road stretched out before me like a ribbon of ink, my high beams cutting through the darkness and illuminating nothing but painted lines and the occasional reflective marker post. There was no moon that night, just a sky full of stars that seemed too far away to matter, and the kind of darkness that feels thick enough to touch. I wasn't tired exactly, but I was in that zone that long-haul drivers know well, that trance-like state where your body is driving but your mind is somewhere else entirely, running through grocery lists and unpaid bills and whether you remembered to call your daughter on her birthday last week. The radio had lost its signal about 20 miles back, leaving nothing but static and the occasional ghost of a preacher's voice shouting about salvation, so I'd switched it off and let the rumble of the engine and the whine of the tires be my only company. That's why I heard it so clearly when the sound started. That soft thumping noise that seemed to be coming from somewhere outside the cab, rhythmic and steady like a heartbeat or footsteps keeping pace with my rig. At first I figured it was just road noise. Maybe something caught in the wheel well or a piece of retread rubber slapping against the undercarriage, but the sound was too regular, too deliberate. And it seemed to be moving, traveling from the back of the trailer toward the front, like something was walking along the length of my truck. I checked my mirrors but saw nothing except darkness and the faint red glow of my own taillights reflected back at me. The thumping continued, growing louder now, closer, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up in that primitive way that tells you something is fundamentally wrong, even when your rational mind is still trying to explain it away. Then I saw it. Or rather, I saw the shadow of it crossing in front of my headlights about 50 yards ahead, moving from the shoulder to the center of the road with a strange, loping gait that didn't match any animal I knew. It was tall, maybe 6 feet or more, with long limbs that seemed to bend at wrong angles, and it moved with a stuttering, jerking motion like a film reel skipping frames. My foot hit the brake instinctively, but I was going 70 and hauling 40,000 pounds, and physics doesn't care about fear or confusion. The figure in the road didn't run or dive out of the way. Instead, it turned toward my approaching headlights, and I saw what might have been a face, pale and featureless as a dinner plate, and then I hit it. The impact wasn't like hitting a deer or even a person, though God help me, I've never hit a person and hope I never do. There was a wet, heavy thud that seemed to shake the entire cab, and something dark sprayed across my windshield. But when I finally got the rig stopped and sat there in the middle of the empty highway with my hazards blinking and my heart hammering against my ribs, the windshield was clean. Not just clean, but spotless, like I'd just run it through a truck wash. And when I climbed down from the cab with my flashlight and walked back along the road, scanning the asphalt for blood or fur or any sign of what I'd hit, there was nothing. No body, no blood, no skid marks except my own. Nothing but empty road stretching in both directions and that suffocating darkness pressing in from all sides. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, sweeping my flashlight back and forth across the pavement and the shoulders, looking for something, anything, that would prove I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The night was absolutely silent except for the distant ping of my cooling engine and the sound of my own breathing, harsh and fast in my ears. Then I heard it again, that soft thumping sound, and this time it was coming from inside my trailer. My blood went cold and my hand tightened on the flashlight until my knuckles went white. And I knew with absolute certainty that I should not, under any circumstances, open those trailer doors. Whatever I'd hit, whatever had been standing in the road with its impossible angles and its blank face, it had gotten inside somehow. And it was in there with my load of office furniture and filing cabinets. Moving around in the darkness, I got back in my cab faster than I've ever moved in my life, locked the doors, and drove. I drove straight through to Omaha without stopping, without checking my load, without even slowing down except when I absolutely had to. When I finally reached the distribution center and backed up to the loading dock, I told the foreman I needed him to open the doors, that I thought my lock might be jammed. He gave me a strange look but did it anyway, and when those doors swung open there was nothing unusual inside. The furniture was all secured and strapped down exactly as it should be, not a single item out of place. But the inside of that trailer was cold, so cold that our breath came out in clouds even though it was 70 degrees outside, and there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, like standing water and rotting vegetation. The foreman and his crew unloaded everything without comment, probably thinking I was just another road-crazy trucker who'd spent too many hours alone in the cab. And maybe they were right. Maybe I did imagine the whole thing, some hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too much caffeine and the monotony of endless dark roads. But I know what I felt when I hit that thing, that wet, heavy impact that shook my bones, and I know what I heard thumping around in my trailer. I still drive Route 52 sometimes when the loads and the schedules demand it, but I never drive it at night anymore, and I always check my trailer before I close those doors. Because sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep in whatever truck stop or rest area I've parked in for the night, I hear that soft thumping sound again, faint and far away, like something is still looking for me, still trying to finish whatever business we started on that dark stretch of Nebraska highway. Story 2. The truck stop, with only one customer, me from Rusty. Joe, there are truck stops scattered across this country like beads on a broken necklace, each one essentially the same as the last, with their bright fluorescent lights and their aisles of energy drinks and beef jerky, their showers that never quite get clean, and their parking lots that smell like diesel and bad decisions. After 23 years behind the wheel, I've stopped at hundreds of them, maybe thousands, and they all blur together in my memory into one endless, brightly lit nowhere. But there's one truck stop I'll never forget, one that I still see sometimes when I close my eyes at night, and I've spent the last 4 years trying to convince myself that it was real, that I didn't just dream the whole thing during a micro-sleep behind the wheel. It was late January, one of those bitter cold nights when the temperature drops below zero, and the wind comes howling across the plains like something angry and alive. And I was running a load of automotive parts from Detroit to Kansas City. I'd been driving for about 9 hours straight, pushing the limits of my logbook in ways I probably shouldn't admit to. And the cold was so intense that even with my heater running full blast, I could see my breath in the cab. My fuel gauge was riding low, the orange needle hovering just above the red, and I was starting to worry that I might not make it to the next major stop when I saw the sign rising out of the darkness ahead. A tall pole with a faded logo I didn't recognize, and the words, "Truck Stop Diesel Food, open 24 hours," glowing in blue and white neon. The place appeared suddenly, materializing out of the darkness like it had been waiting for me, and I felt a surge of relief as I signaled and pulled off the highway onto the access road. The parking lot was empty, not a single vehicle in sight, which struck me as odd for a truck stop on a major interstate route. But I figured maybe the cold was keeping people away, or maybe I'd just hit a lucky lull in the traffic. The building itself was older than most truck stops I knew, a low, squat structure that looked like it had been built sometime in the 60s and hadn't been updated since, with grimy windows and a flickering neon sign above the door that buzzed and popped in the silence. I pulled up to the diesel pumps and shut down my engine, and the silence that followed was so complete it was almost painful. There was no sound at all, no wind, no distant traffic, no hum of refrigeration units or clatter of other diesels idling. Nothing but a vast, heavy quiet that seemed to press against my ears. I sat there for a moment, my hand on the door handle, feeling suddenly reluctant to leave the cab. But I needed fuel, and I needed coffee, and I needed to use a bathroom that wasn't a plastic bottle. So I zipped up my jacket and stepped out into the cold. The temperature hit me like a physical blow, so cold it burned in my lungs and made my eyes water, and I hurried toward the building with my head down and my hands jammed into my pockets. The door had one of those old bells attached to it, the kind that jingles when you walk in. But when I pushed through, it made no sound, and I found myself standing in a brightly lit interior that smelled like old coffee and something else, something sour and organic that I couldn't quite identify. The aisles were fully stocked with all the usual truck stop merchandise, candy bars and chips and magazines, but everything looked slightly off somehow. The brands not quite right, the labels printed in fonts I didn't recognize, and when I picked up what I thought was a Snickers bar, the wrapper felt wrong in my hand. The chocolate inside somehow too soft, too warm. There was no one behind the counter, no bored attendant scrolling through their phone or stocking cigarettes, just an empty stool and a register that looked like it belonged in a museum. I called out a hello, but my voice seemed to die in the air, falling flat without even an echo. And when no one responded, I walked toward the back of the store where the coffee station usually was. I found it tucked into a corner, an ancient drip machine with a half-full pot of something that might have been coffee sitting on a burner. The liquid inside so dark it was almost black. And when I poured myself a cup, the smell that rose up made my stomach turn, like burnt hair and spoiled meat. I set the cup down without tasting it and turned to leave, suddenly desperate to get back to my truck and back on the road. But as I turned, I saw something that stopped me cold. There was a bulletin board on the wall covered in the usual truck stop notices, ads for loads and lost pets and drivers looking for work. But pinned right in the center was a photograph, and the photograph was of me. It was me, unmistakably standing in front of my truck in what looked like this very parking lot. But I was older in the picture, my face more lined and my hair completely gray, and I was staring directly at the camera with an expression I couldn't read, something between fear and resignation. My hands started shaking and I felt a cold sweat break out across my back despite the chill in the building. I reached for the photograph thinking I must be mistaken, that it must be someone who just looked like me. But before I could touch it, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, and a voice said my name. Not just my first name or my CB handle, but my full name, first and last and middle initial, pronounced perfectly in a voice that sounded like mine but older, rougher, like I was hearing myself speak through decades of cigarettes and screaming. I spun around, but there was no one there, just empty aisles and that too bright fluorescent lighting that seemed to hum with a frequency that made my teeth ache. The footsteps continued, though, circling around me, and I could hear breathing now, heavy and wet, and smell that sour organic scent growing stronger. I backed toward the door, not taking my eyes off the empty store, and my hand found the handle and pulled, and then I was outside in the cold again, running across the parking lot toward my truck with the sound of those footsteps following, getting closer. I didn't stop to fuel up, didn't stop to look back, just jumped in my cab and turned the key and felt my engine roar to life. And as I pulled out of that parking lot, I looked in my mirror and saw someone standing in the doorway of the truck stop, illuminated by the flickering neon, and it was me. It was me exactly as I'd looked in that photograph. Older and grayer and staring after my truck with that same unreadable expression. and as I watched, he raised one hand in a wave or maybe a warning. And then I was back on the highway and accelerating, and that place was disappearing into the darkness behind me. I made it to Kansas City on fumes, literally coasting into a proper truck stop with my fuel light screaming, and my hands still shaking on the wheel. I've looked for that place since, studied maps and driven that same stretch of highway a dozen times in daylight, but I've never found it again. No exit where I remember turning off. No access road, no sign of any building at all, just empty fields and fence posts and the highway rolling on forever. Sometimes I wonder if I'm still there, if I never really left, if the version of me that drove away was just another layer of whatever that place was, and the real me is still standing inside, looking at photographs of futures I'll never reach. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my cab, I hear footsteps circling in the darkness outside, slow and deliberate, and a voice that sounds like mine calling my name. Story 3. The forest that followed my route from Silent Steve, they call me Silent Steve because I don't talk much on the CB, never have, and after what I experienced on my run through the Pacific Northwest last October, I talk even less. I've been hauling timber and lumber for the better part of 15 years, running routes through Washington and Oregon and Northern California, and I know these forests like I know my own truck. Every twist and turn of the mountain roads, every vista and overlook. These are ancient woods, old-growth forests where the trees reach up so high you can barely see the sky, and the undergrowth grows so thick that the forest floor stays in permanent twilight, even at noon. I've always respected these woods, felt the weight of all those years and all those trees, but I never feared them until the night they started following me. I was hauling a load of dimensional lumber from a mill in Eugene down to Sacramento, a run I'd made 50 times before, taking Highway 101 through the coastal range. It was early October, and the weather was just starting to turn, the days getting shorter and the nights carrying that sharp edge of coming winter. I'd left the mill around 5 in the evening, later than I'd planned, and by the time I was an hour into my drive, the sun had set completely, and I was running through darkness with my headlights cutting twin tunnels through the trees that pressed in from both sides of the road. The forest in this part of Oregon is something special. Old Douglas firs and Sitka spruce that have been growing since before this country was founded. Their trunks so wide it would take 3 men holding hands to circle them. The road winds through them like a snake, climbing and descending through mountain passes, and on either side the trees march off into darkness so complete that your headlights can't penetrate more than a few feet. I'd driven this road countless times and never felt anything but a kind of peaceful solitude. But that night something was different. The trees seemed closer somehow, leaning in toward the road, and in the gaps between them I thought I could see movement, shadows shifting and flowing like water. I told myself it was just the play of my headlights, the way the beams swept across the trunks as I navigated the curves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something in those trees was tracking my progress with interest that felt far from benign. I turned on my CB radio for company, but there was nothing. Not even static, just dead silence, like every trucker in the world had suddenly stopped talking. The quiet started to feel oppressive, pressing in on me like the darkness outside, and I reached for my phone to put on some music, something to fill the space. But I had no signal, not even a single bar, which was odd because I usually had at least some coverage on this route. That's when I noticed that the forest on my right side, the passenger side, looked different than the forest on my left. The trees were the same species, the same general size and shape, but their arrangement felt wrong somehow. Too regular, too deliberate, like they'd been planted in rows rather than growing naturally over centuries. I watched them in my side mirror as I drove past, and I could swear they were moving. Not swaying in wind, but actually shifting position, rotating to follow my truck as it passed, their branches reaching out like arms or fingers. I picked up speed, pushing my rig a little harder than I probably should on these winding mountain roads, telling myself I was being ridiculous but unable to shake the mounting sense of dread that was settling in my chest. The trees continued to flow past on both sides, and now I was certain they were moving, repositioning themselves, because I kept seeing the same formations, the same distinctive groupings, and the same oddly twisted trunk, appearing again and again on my right side like they were racing through the forest to get ahead of me and reappear in my view. Then my headlights caught something up ahead, something that didn't belong, and I felt my foot ease off the accelerator as my brain tried to process what I was seeing. There was a gap in the trees on the left side of the road, and in that gap stood what looked like a small grove of birches, their white bark almost glowing in my headlights. But birches don't grow naturally in this part of Oregon, and as I drew closer I realized they weren't birches at all. They were too white, too smooth, and they were moving, swaying and bending in a way that no tree should move. And then I was past them and my eyes met my driver's side mirror and I saw that they had turned, all of them, to watch me go. The next 30 miles were the longest of my life. Driving through darkness with my hands locked on the wheel and my eyes darting between the road ahead and the mirrors on either side, watching the forest flow and shift and reposition itself around me. The trees seemed to be getting closer now, encroaching on the shoulders of the road, their branches hanging lower, and several times I heard the scrape of pine needles against the side of my trailer, a sound that set my teeth on edge and made my scalp prickle with primal fear. I tried to tell myself there had to be a rational explanation, that I was tired or maybe coming down with something, that there was probably carbon monoxide leaking into my cab and giving me hallucinations, but rational explanations couldn't account for what I saw when I crested a hill and found the road ahead blocked by a wall of trees. Not trees that had fallen across the road, but trees that were standing upright, growing directly in the middle of the asphalt. A solid mass of trunks and branches that completely filled the roadway for as far as my headlights could reach. I slammed on my brakes and my rig jackknifed slightly as the trailer swung wide, and I came to a stop maybe 20 feet from that impossible wall of forest. My heart hammering and my hands shaking and my mind screaming that this couldn't be real. I sat there for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, staring at that wall of trees and trying to decide what to do, whether to try to back up along the winding mountain road in the dark or just sit here until morning when surely this would all make sense. And then slowly, deliberately, the trees began to move. They didn't fall or topple, they simply withdrew, pulling back from the road like a curtain being drawn, separating and sliding sideways into the forest on either side until the road was clear again, empty and innocent as if nothing had ever been there. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I put my rig in gear and drove, pushing through the gap the trees had left, accelerating harder than I should have and taking corners faster than was safe. Desperate to get out of those woods and back into open country, the trees continued to press in from both sides, but they didn't block the road again, just watched me pass with what felt like malevolent attention. And when I finally burst out of the forest into the flatlands of Northern California, with fields on either side and a sky full of stars overhead, I nearly wept with relief. I drove straight through to Sacramento without stopping. Didn't even slow down until I was pulling into the delivery yard. And when I climbed down from my cab, my legs were shaking so badly I could hardly stand. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it all, that exhaustion and darkness and an overactive imagination had conspired to play tricks on me. But when I walked around to inspect my trailer, I found deep scratches along both sides, long gouges in the paint that looked like they'd been made by branches or thorns, and caught in the wheel wells were pine needles and chunks of bark from trees that don't grow in Oregon, that don't grow anywhere in North America as far as I know. Species I couldn't identify with wood so dark it was almost black, and a smell like rot and deep earth. I still drive routes through the Pacific Northwest, still haul timber and lumber through those ancient forests, but I don't drive them at night anymore, and I always make sure I have a full tank and perfect weather before I start, because I know now that those woods are aware, that they watch and remember, and for reasons I can't begin to understand. They followed me that night, tracking my progress like a predator tracks prey. And sometimes, when I'm parked for the night in some well-lit truck stop far from any trees, I dream that I wake up to find my truck surrounded by forest, that the woods have found me again, and this time there's nowhere to run. And in the dream I can hear them whispering my name through the branches, calling me to come outside and walk among them, to leave my truck behind and disappear into the darkness between the trees, where the old things wait and watch and hunger for reasons no human mind was meant to understand. Story 4. The Gas Station Worker. With a hollow face from Diesel Dan. In all my years on the road, I've met thousands of people, truckers and dispatchers and dock workers, and the countless faces behind counters at gas stations and convenience stores, and most of them blur together in my memory into a generic composite of tired eyes and forced smiles and voices that say the same things over and over. But there's one face I'll never forget, or rather one absence of a face. Something I encountered at a rural gas station in West Texas that still visits me in nightmares and makes me question what I think I know about the world and the things that inhabit it. It was the middle of August, high summer in the desert, and I was running a load of industrial equipment from Houston to Phoenix, driving through the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and turns the horizon into a wavering mirage. My air conditioning was struggling to keep up, and I'd gone through 3 bottles of water in the last 2 hours, sweating through my shirt and feeling the steering wheel grow slick under my palms. The sun was setting as I crossed into West Texas, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and as the darkness began to gather, I realized I needed to fuel up soon, or risk running dry in the long empty stretches between towns. The gas station appeared like an answer to a prayer, a small independent operation that consisted of 2 ancient pumps, a cinder block building that might have been white once, and a hand-painted sign that read "Gas Diesel Cold Drinks" in letters that had faded to the color of old bone. There were no other vehicles in the lot, no lights in the windows of the nearby houses that lined the empty highway, and the whole scene had a quality of abandonment that made me hesitate before pulling off the road. But my fuel gauge was showing less than a quarter tank, and the next town was another 70 miles, so I signaled and turned in, gravel crunching under my tires as I pulled up to the diesel pump. The sun had fully set now, and the sky was that particular shade of deep blue that comes just before true darkness, and the only light came from a single buzzing fluorescent fixture mounted above the door to the building. I shut down my engine and stepped out into air that was still breathtakingly hot despite the hour, the kind of heat that radiates up from the ground and seems to come from the earth itself. I swiped my card at the pump, but the reader was broken or disconnected, just a blank screen that stared back at me, so I walked toward the building to pay inside, my boots loud on the concrete and the silence around me so complete I could hear my own breathing. The door was propped open with a cinder block, and I stepped inside to find an interior that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s, with yellowed linoleum floors and metal shelves stocked with dusty cans and packages that might have been sitting there for decades. There was a counter at the back with an old mechanical register on top, and behind the counter stood a man in a stained white shirt. And when he turned to face me, I felt something fundamental shift in my perception of reality. At first glance, he looked normal enough. Average height and build, middle-aged with dark hair and the kind of deep tan you get from working outdoors in the desert sun. But as I approached the counter and he looked directly at me, I realized there was something profoundly wrong with his face, or rather, with where his face should have been. His features were there, I could see them, eyes and nose and mouth in the proper arrangement, but they seemed to have no depth, no dimension, like they were painted onto a flat surface rather than being part of a 3-dimensional head. And when he moved, when he tilted his head or turned slightly, his face didn't change the way a normal face would, didn't show different angles or cast different shadows. It remained perfectly flat and forward-facing no matter which way he turned, like a mask that had been stuck to the front of his head. I stood there frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing, while he watched me with eyes that seemed to have no depth or moisture, just dark circles that might have been holes punched through that flat surface. He didn't blink, I realized, didn't show any of the small unconscious movements that make a face seem alive. No breath stirring his chest, no pulse visible in his neck. Just perfect, terrible stillness. And then he smiled, or something approximating a smile, his mouth widening in a way that seemed mechanical rather than organic. And he spoke in a voice that sounded like it was coming from far away, from somewhere behind that flat mask of a face. "How much gas?" he asked, and the words were perfectly clear but wrong somehow, lacking the resonance that comes from breath moving through a throat and shaping itself with tongue and teeth. I tried to answer, but my voice caught in my throat, and I had to swallow twice before I could force out the words. Telling him I needed diesel, $40 worth, my voice higher and tighter than normal. He nodded. That same mechanical movement, and held out his hand for my money. I fumbled with my wallet, hands shaking slightly, and pulled out 2 20s, laying them on the counter rather than handing them directly to him because I couldn't bear the thought of our skin making contact. He picked up the bills with fingers that moved with precision but no fluidity, like a machine mimicking human movement. And when he turned to the register, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The back of his head was the same as the front, completely flat, and I could see his face still staring at me even though he'd turned around. That painted-on arrangement of features locked in forward position, while his body moved independently. He completed the transaction with his back to me, or what should have been his back, and when he turned around again I saw that he now had 2 faces, one on each side of his head, both identical, both staring at me with those depthless eyes. He told me I could pump my diesel now, his voice still coming from that distant place, and I backed toward the door without taking my eyes off him, my hand fumbling behind me for the door frame. As I reached the exit, he spoke again, asking if I needed anything else, and I saw that his mouth wasn't moving when he talked, just remained frozen in that approximation of a smile while the words seemed to emanate from somewhere inside or behind him. I ran to my truck, actually ran, something I hadn't done in years, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the fuel nozzle. I pumped exactly $40 worth of diesel, watching the building the entire time, and I saw him standing in the doorway now, or multiple versions of him, because there seemed to be 2 or 3 figures occupying the same space, all with that same flat face and frozen smile, and they were all watching me with perfect, unwavering attention. The fuel pump clicked off, and I jammed the nozzle back into its holder and climbed into my cab faster than I've ever moved. And as I turned my key and heard my engine roar to life, I looked one more time at the doorway. He was walking toward me now, moving with a strange gliding motion like his feet weren't quite touching the ground, and as he came closer I could see more faces appearing, covering his entire body. His chest and arms and legs all identical, all staring at me with those hollow eyes. I threw my truck into gear and peeled out of that parking lot with gravel spraying and my tires squealing. And in my mirror I saw him standing in the middle of the road, covered now in hundreds of faces, a walking mass of those flat painted features, and they were all smiling that mechanical smile as I raced away into the darkness. I drove for 3 hours straight without stopping, pushing well past the legal limits, desperate to put distance between myself and that place. When I finally pulled into a well-lit truck stop outside of Phoenix, I sat in my cab for 20 minutes just breathing, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was a hallucination brought on by heat exhaustion or dehydration. But when I checked my receipt from the fuel purchase, it was real, printed on old thermal paper with the name of that gas station and the date and time, proof that I'd been there, that something had taken my money and authorized my fuel. I've driven that stretch of highway several times since then, always in daylight, and I've never been able to find that gas station again. The mile markers match up to where it should be, but there's nothing there except empty desert and scrub brush. No sign that a building ever stood in that spot. But sometimes late at night when I'm alone in my cab, I catch a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision, a flat face staring at me from the darkness outside my window, and I hear that distant voice asking if I need anything else, and I drive a little faster and keep my eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead, because I know that some things are best left unexamined, some mysteries better left unsolved, and some faces are meant to remain unseen. Story 5. The road that ended at my own truck from Iron Ike. They call me Iron Ike because I've got a reputation for being unshakable, the kind of driver who doesn't rattle easy, who's seen it all and done it all and lived to tell the tale. I've driven through blizzards and tornadoes, navigated roads that would make a mountain goat nervous, kept my rig upright through situations that should have put me in a ditch or worse, and through it all, I've maintained that iron composure that earned me my name. But what happened to me on a lonely stretch of Montana highway last winter shook me to my core and made me question everything I thought I knew about roads and destinations and the nature of reality itself. I was hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Fargo to Seattle, running a route that took me through the northern plains and into the mountain passes of Montana. It was late December, the dead of winter, and a storm system had been tracking across the region for days, dropping snow and ice and making driving conditions treacherous. I'd been monitoring the weather reports and checking road conditions obsessively, trying to time my route to slip between the worst of the storms. But Mother Nature had other plans, and I found myself driving into increasingly heavy snowfall as I crossed into Montana just after midnight. The visibility got worse with every mile, the snow coming down so thick and fast that my wipers could barely keep the windshield clear, and the road ahead was just a narrow tunnel of white illuminated by my headlights. I'd slowed to 40 miles per hour, then 30, following the reflection of my own lights off the snow-covered pavement and the occasional marker post, and I was seriously considering pulling over to wait out the storm when I noticed something odd about the road ahead. It looked different somehow, the snow pattern not quite right. And as I drew closer, I realized I was seeing tracks, tire tracks in the fresh snow, recent enough that they hadn't been filled in yet. That in itself wasn't unusual. There were other vehicles on the road, even in these conditions. But what struck me as strange was that these tracks looked exactly like the ones my own rig would make. The distinctive pattern of my specific tire treads and the width of my wheelbase. I told myself it was just coincidence, that plenty of trucks probably had similar tires, but the tracks continued ahead of me, perfectly centered in my lane, and they had a quality that made them seem fresh, like they'd been made just moments before I arrived. I followed those tracks for the next 10 miles, watching them wind through the storm ahead of me. And slowly I became convinced that I was following myself, that somehow I was looking at the trail my own truck had left. But that was impossible. I'd never driven this exact stretch of road before, I was certain of that, and yet the tracks matched mine perfectly, every detail identical. The snow was falling harder now, accumulating on my windshield faster than my wipers could clear it, and the world outside had been reduced to a swirling white void, broken only by those mysterious tracks leading me forward. Then the tracks began to change, veering slightly to the right, and I followed them automatically, trusting their guidance more than my own sense of direction in the blinding snow. They led me off the main highway onto what seemed to be a smaller road, though it was hard to tell with everything covered in white, and the landscape around me began to feel different, more enclosed, like I was driving through a canyon or valley, even though I knew from my maps that this area should be open plains. The storm seemed to be lessening slightly, or maybe I was just getting used to it, and through the curtain of snow I began to see shapes, darker patches that might have been rocks or trees or buildings. The tracks ahead of me were still clear, and I continued to follow them, taking turns when they turned, slowing when they slowed, and it occurred to me that I had no idea where I was anymore, that I'd lost all sense of direction and distance. I reached for my GPS, but the screen was blank, showing no signal. And when I checked my odometer, I was disturbed to see that it was running backwards, the numbers decreasing as I drove forward. The shapes outside were getting clearer now, and I realized with a start that they were trucks, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, parked in neat rows on either side of the road. They were all semis, all different makes and models, and they were all covered in snow as if they'd been sitting there for years. Some of them had their lights on, dim glows behind frosted windshields, and as I drove past, I thought I could see figures sitting motionless in the cabs. Dark silhouettes that didn't move or respond to my passing. The tracks I was following led me deeper into this graveyard of trucks, winding between the parked vehicles, and my unease was growing into something approaching panic. I tried to turn around, to backtrack the way I'd come, but when I looked, in my mirrors I saw that the road behind me had disappeared, filled in with parked trucks that definitely hadn't been there moments before. I was boxed in, committed to following these tracks to wherever they led, and ahead of me I could see the road beginning to curve, describing a long arc to the left. I followed that curve, my speed dropping to barely 10 miles per hour, and as I came around the bend, I saw something that made my mind rebel against accepting what my eyes were showing me. There, parked at the end of the road, sitting silent and dark with snow piling on its cab and trailer, was my truck. Not a truck like mine, but my actual truck, with my company logo on the door and my CB antenna and the distinctive dent in the passenger side panel that I'd gotten 3 years ago in a parking lot in Tulsa, and in the driver's seat, visible through the windshield, was me. I was sitting there motionless, staring straight ahead with empty eyes, my hands on the wheel in the 10 and 2 position, and I was covered in frost like I'd been there for hours or days or longer. I stared at myself, staring at nothing, my brain struggling to process the impossible sight, and slowly the figure in the truck began to turn its head, moving with mechanical precision, until it was looking directly at me. Its mouth opened, my mouth, and it began to speak. And even though I couldn't hear the words through the glass in the distance, I could read its lips, and it was saying my name over and over, a warning or a greeting or a curse. I slammed my truck into reverse, not caring anymore about where I'd been or how I'd gotten here, just desperate to get away from that impossible vision of myself, frozen and dead at the end of the road. My tires spun in the snow and my truck fishtailed, wildly, and I cranked the wheel hard to the right, forcing my rig into a position where I could turn around. The trucks on either side of me were closer now, pressing in, and I saw their doors opening, figures stepping out into the snow, and they all looked like me. Dozens of versions of myself surrounding my truck and reaching toward me with frost-covered hands. I found traction somehow, and my truck lurched forward, back the way I'd come, and I drove like a madman through that maze of parked vehicles, taking turns at random, desperate to find a way out. The other versions of myself were following, running, through the snow with inhuman speed, and I could hear their voices now, all speaking in unison, saying that I should stop, that I should park and turn off my engine and join them, that this was where I belonged, where I'd always been heading. Then suddenly the storm was back, the snow falling thick and heavy, and the parked trucks disappeared as if they'd never been there. I was back on the main highway. I could see the center line and the mile markers, and my GPS flickered back to life, showing my correct position. I drove until I reached the next town and pulled into the first truck stop I saw, and when I climbed down from my cab, I saw that my odometer was reading normally again, though I'd somehow lost 3 hours that I couldn't account for. I finished that run to Seattle, but I drove straight through, didn't stop except for fuel, and I refused to look too closely at any of the trucks I passed along the way, afraid I might see my own face looking back at me from their cabs. I still drive, still haul loads across the country, but I never drive alone through storms anymore, and I always make sure I know exactly where I am and where I'm going. Because I know now that there are roads that don't appear on any map, destinations, that exist outside normal space and time, and somewhere in the snowy darkness of a Montana winter, there's a version of me still sitting behind the wheel, frozen and waiting, at the end of a road that loops back on itself forever. Story 6. The woman who crawled out of my CB speaker from Big Rig. Billy've been talking on the CB radio for 30 years. Ever since I started driving professionally, and I've heard just about everything you can imagine coming through those speakers. I've heard truckers spinning tales and sharing information, heard lonely voices reaching out across the miles for human connection, heard arguments and jokes and confessions and lies. The CB is the lifeblood of the trucking community, the invisible thread that connects us all across the vast distances of the American highway system. And I've always loved the crackle of static and the familiar cadence of trucker slang, the sense that no matter how alone you might feel in your cab, there are others out there on the road sharing your journey. But after what came through my CB speaker on a night last spring, somewhere in the empty stretches of Nevada desert, I don't talk on the radio much anymore, and when I do, I keep the volume low and my hand near the power switch, ready to cut off whatever might try to come through. Because I learned that the CB doesn't just carry voices across distances. Sometimes it carries things that aren't voices at all. Things that use our words and our frequencies to travel from wherever they've been waiting into our world, into our trucks, into the small safe spaces we think we control. It was 3 a.m. and I was hauling electronics from Reno to Los Angeles, running through the desert on Highway 95 with nothing around me but darkness and sand, and the occasional distant light of some isolated ranch house or mining operation. The night was clear and cold, the kind of desert cold that surprises people who think of Nevada as nothing but heat. And my heater was running steadily while I listened to the quiet chatter on the CB. There were a few other drivers out there, voices I didn't recognize, talking about road conditions and fuel prices and the usual topics that fill the dead hours of the night. Then a woman's voice came through my speaker, clear and close like she was sitting right next to me, and she said my name, not my CB handle, which is Big Rig Bill, but my actual legal name that I haven't used on the radio in years, maybe ever. I felt a chill run down my spine and I picked up my mic to ask who was calling. But before I could key it, she spoke again, and this time her voice was different, layered somehow, like multiple people speaking in near-perfect unison. She said she needed a ride, that she'd been waiting by the side of the road for such a long time, and could I please stop and pick her up? Her voice was hypnotic, almost musical, and I found my foot easing off the accelerator before my rational mind kicked in and reminded me that I was alone on an empty stretch of highway, that I hadn't passed any vehicles or seen any people for the last 20 miles. And that there was no way someone could be calling me on the CB from the roadside. I accelerated again and tried to change channels, but her voice followed me, coming through on every frequency, and now she was pleading, saying she was so cold, so alone, that she'd been waiting for someone like me for longer than I could imagine. The other voices on the CB had gone silent, or maybe they'd never been real in the first place. And now it was just me and this woman's voice that seemed to be getting louder, closer, filling my cab despite the fact that my volume knob was turned down low. I told her I couldn't stop, that I had a schedule to keep, and she laughed, a sound like wind chimes or breaking glass, and said that schedules didn't matter, that time didn't matter, that nothing mattered except that I stop and let her in. I was getting genuinely frightened now, my hands tight on the wheel and my eyes scanning the darkness ahead for any sign of a figure by the roadside. But the highway remained empty. Her voice continued, taking on a quality that was harder to understand, words that didn't sound quite like English anymore, syllables that hurt my ears and made my vision blur. I reached for the CB to turn it off completely, but my hand froze halfway there, and I watched in horror as the speaker began to bulge outward, the plastic mesh distorting like something was pushing against it from inside. The voice was screaming now, or singing, I couldn't tell which, and the speaker grill burst outward with a sound like tearing metal. Something white and thin emerged, A hand or something like a hand. Fingers too long and joints bending in too many places. And it grasped the edge of the opening and pulled. More of it came through. An arm extending impossibly far from the small speaker. Pale flesh or something resembling flesh stretching and distending as it emerged into my cab. I was frozen in shock, still driving but unable to look away. Watching as a shoulder appeared, then a head. Long dark hair hanging across a face that was turned away from me. She pulled herself through that impossible opening with a liquid grace, her body seeming to fold and compress in ways that defied anatomy. And I could see now that she was naked or wearing something so thin it might as well have been skin. And her form was beautiful in a way that frightened me. Too perfect, too symmetrical, like an artist's idealized rendering of a woman rather than an actual person. She was still making sounds. That voice that had come through the CB now emanating directly from her. And she turned to face me with a smile that was too wide and eyes that reflected my headlights like an animal's. I screamed, finally breaking my paralysis, and yanked the wheel hard to the right. My truck veered off the highway onto the shoulder and I hit the brakes. And in the chaos of the sudden stop, the woman thing was thrown forward, colliding with the windshield. She pressed against the glass for a moment, her face inches from mine, those reflective eyes staring into me. And then she was gone, simply vanished, and I was alone in my cab with just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the tick of my cooling engine. The CB radio was intact, the speaker showing no damage, no sign of the terrible birth I'd witnessed. I checked every inch of my cab with my flashlight, looking for any trace of her, any evidence that she'd been real. But there was nothing. The only thing unusual was a smell, faint but distinct, like ozone or electricity, like the air smells after a lightning strike. I sat there for the rest of the night with my doors locked and my lights on. And when dawn finally came and the desert emerged from darkness, I continued to Los Angeles at a speed well above the limit, desperate to reach lights and people and the mundane safety of civilization. I had the CB radio replaced at the next major stop, told the mechanic it was malfunctioning, even though it worked perfectly when he tested it. I bought a new one and installed it myself, but I never turn it on anymore except in emergencies, and even then I keep the volume barely audible. Because sometimes late at night when I'm alone on empty roads, I hear tapping from inside that speaker, like fingernails on glass, and a voice so faint I might be imagining it, saying my name over and over, asking when I'm going to let her in, telling me she's still waiting. She's always waiting, and sooner or later everyone stops to pick her up. The other drivers have noticed I don't talk on the radio anymore, and they've started calling me Silent Bill instead of Big Rig Bill. And I let them think whatever they want to think, that I'm antisocial or crazy or just tired of the chatter. It's better than telling them the truth, that there are things out there in the static between frequencies, in the empty spaces where signals travel, things that can hear us when we speak into the dark, and sometimes, if they want to badly enough, they can use our words and our voices as a bridge to cross over into our world. I know I should probably warn them, should tell my story to anyone who'll listen, but who would believe me, and what good would it do anyway? The CB radio is essential to what we do, and asking truckers to give it up would be like asking them to give up their eyes or their hands. So I keep my silence, and I drive my routes, and I try not to think about that night in the Nevada desert. Try not to wonder where she came from or what she wanted or whether she's still out there, waiting by the side of some dark highway for the next trucker who answers her call. And when I hear other drivers talking on the CB, hear them laughing and joking and filling the lonely hours with companionship, I feel a pang of loss for what I've given up. But I also feel a cold certainty that I made the right choice, because some forms of connection aren't worth the risk, some voices shouldn't be answered. And sometimes the loneliness of a silent cab is preferable to the alternative, to learning firsthand what waits in the spaces between our words. Story 7. The rest stop lights that blinked in Morse code from Highway Hank I served in the Navy for 8 years before I became a trucker. Spent my time in radio communications on a destroyer in the Pacific, and one of the skills they drilled into us until it became second nature was Morse code. Even though modern communication has moved beyond the need for dots and dashes, those patterns are burned into my brain so deep that I automatically translate them whenever I encounter them, whether it's a turn signal that happens to flash in a meaningful rhythm or a light fixture with a bad ballast that stutters in a way that resembles code. It's become such an unconscious process that I often don't even realize I'm doing it until I've already decoded the message. My brain working in the background to translate rhythm into meaning. That particular skill, which I'd always considered nothing more than an interesting quirk of my military past, saved my life at a rest stop in West Virginia 2 years ago, and it also revealed something about the world that I wish I'd never learned. I was hauling furniture from North Carolina to Ohio, running through the Appalachian Mountains on Interstate 77, and it was around midnight when I decided I needed to stop and rest. I'd been driving for 10 hours and my eyes were starting to burn with fatigue, and when I saw the sign for a rest area ahead, I signaled and pulled off the highway gratefully. The rest stop was one of those older facilities that consist of a small brick building with restrooms and vending machines, a few picnic tables scattered under trees, and a parking lot with spaces marked out for both cars and trucks. There were no other vehicles when I arrived, which wasn't particularly unusual for that time of night, and the building was lit by several overhead lights mounted on tall poles, the kind of harsh fluorescent fixtures that turn everything beneath them into stark contrasts of light and shadow. I parked in the truck section and sat for a moment, debating whether to just sleep in my cab or go inside to use the facilities first. That's when I noticed the lights were blinking. Not all of them, but several. And not in the random flicker of bad wiring, but in a distinct pattern. My brain, trained by years of military service, began automatically translating ... SOS, the international distress signal. I sat up straighter, suddenly more alert, and watched the lights carefully. The pattern repeated over and over, SOS, 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 and mixed in with it were other signals. Other letters forming words that my mind decoded even as part of me was insisting this had to be coincidence, that lights couldn't deliberately flash Morse code. But they were. And the message was clear. Don't go inside, not safe. They're waiting. The words repeated in an endless loop, and I felt ice forming in my stomach as I stared at the innocent-looking brick building ahead of me. The lights continued their urgent warning, and now I was looking at the rest stop with more careful attention, noticing things I'd missed before. The main door was slightly ajar, even though it should have been closed this late at night. The windows were dark, but not the natural darkness of an empty room, more like something was blocking them from inside. And now that I was really looking, I could see shapes moving behind those windows, shadows that were too large and moved too fluidly to be anything human. I should have started my engine and driven away immediately, should have trusted the warning and put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was waiting in that building, but I was paralyzed by curiosity and disbelief, my mind still trying to rationalize what I was seeing. The lights continued their desperate message, and I began to wonder who or what was sending it, whether someone was trapped in there with whatever those shadows were, or whether the lights themselves were somehow sentient, somehow aware of danger and trying to warn travelers away. Then the door to the building opened wider and something emerged, and I used the word something because it had no other name that fit. It was roughly human-shaped, tall and thin, but it moved in a way that suggested its bones weren't arranged like human bones, all wrong angles and impossible flexibility. It stood in the doorway for a moment, silhouetted against the darkness inside, and then it began walking toward my truck with slow, deliberate steps that suggested infinite patience, like it knew I couldn't escape. That time was on its side. The lights flashed more urgently now, the SOS signal coming faster, and mixed in were new words. Drive now. Don't look back. That broke my paralysis, and I turned my key with shaking hands, heard my engine roar to life, and threw the truck into gear. As I accelerated out of the parking lot, I looked in my mirror and saw the thing breaking into a run, moving with that same wrong-jointed fluidity but covering ground impossibly fast. And behind it, the door of the building had opened fully and more shapes were pouring out. A dozen or more of those tall, thin figures flooding into the parking lot. I pushed my rig as hard as I could, my speedometer climbing past 70, then 80 as I raced up the entrance ramp and back onto the highway. And in my mirrors I could see them chasing, actually keeping pace with my truck for a terrifying few seconds before finally falling behind. The lights of the rest stop receded in the distance, still flashing their warning, and I drove for another 2 hours before I felt safe enough to stop again. This time at a well-lit travel plaza full of other trucks and cars and blessed normal human activity. I reported what I'd seen to the highway patrol, tried to tell them about the creatures and the warning lights, but they looked at me like I'd lost my mind and suggested I was overtired, that I'd experienced some kind of hallucination brought on by fatigue. Maybe they were right, maybe I did imagine the whole thing. But a week later, I checked the news from that area and found a story about a family that had gone missing after stopping at a rest area on I-77 in West Virginia. Their car was found abandoned in the parking lot with the engine still running and the doors wide open. And there was no sign of the family, no indication of where they'd gone or what had happened to them. I've driven past that rest stop several times since then, always during daylight and always without stopping. And every time I do, I see that the lights are still there, still functioning, and if I watch carefully, I can see them blinking in that same pattern, that same urgent warning. I've started paying attention to lights wherever I go, watching for patterns, for messages, and I've found that those rest stop lights aren't unique. There are other places, other locations scattered across the highway system, where lights blink in Morse code, sending warnings or pleas or messages I can't fully understand. And I've come to believe that there's some kind of awareness embedded in the infrastructure of our roads. Some intelligence that exists in the electrical systems and tries to help travelers avoid the dangers that lurk in the dark spaces between cities. I've tried to tell other drivers about this, tried to share what I've learned about reading the lights, but most of them think I'm crazy or joking, and the few who take me seriously usually forget about it after a few days, dismissing it as just another weird trucker tale. But I know what I saw. I know what those lights were telling me. And I know that somewhere in that rest stop building, there's something waiting that doesn't belong in our world. Something that sees travelers as prey or food or worse. And I know that the lights, whatever they are, whoever or whatever is sending those messages, they're trying to protect us, fighting a lonely battle against things we can't see and wouldn't believe in if we could. So now I watch the lights wherever I go, and I've learned to read their warnings, to understand their rhythms. Sometimes they tell me to avoid certain rest stops or truck stops. Sometimes they warn me about roads that lead to places I shouldn't go. And sometimes they just send simple messages of encouragement. Safe travels. Keep moving. Almost home. I've become something of an interpreter, I suppose. A translator between the warning lights and the trucking community, even if most people don't realize that's what I'm doing when I post about road conditions and recommend routes and suggest which rest areas to avoid. The military taught me Morse code as a tool for communication, a way to send and receive messages across distance when other methods failed. But they never taught me that those same patterns could be used by something else, something that exists in the electrical grid and the lighting systems of our highways, to send warnings to those who can still read them. I don't know what those lights are or why they care about protecting human travelers, but I'm grateful for them. And I make sure to acknowledge their warnings, to spread their messages in whatever way I can. Because out there on the dark highways of America, in the empty hours between midnight and dawn, there are things waiting in rest stops and truck stops and roadside facilities, things that hunger for unwary travelers. And sometimes the only thing standing between us and them is a pattern of blinking lights that spell out a message in an obsolete code that nobody uses anymore, except for old sailors like me who learned it long ago and never forgot. Story 8. The passenger who vanished at the state line from Lonely Larry. They call me Lonely Larry. and I suppose the name fits well enough. Though it's not loneliness that keeps me company on these long hauls, so much as a preference for my own thoughts and the quiet intimacy of a solo cab. I've never been one for picking up hitchhikers, never saw the appeal in sharing my space with strangers and their unknown histories and potentially dangerous intentions. But on a cold February night, driving through the Wyoming wilderness, I broke my own rule and let someone into my truck. And what happened when we crossed into Colorado made me question the nature of reality and the boundaries that separate one place from another. I was hauling industrial supplies from Billings to Denver, running through the night because I'd lost time to a delayed loading dock and needed to make up hours. The temperature had dropped below zero, and a thin snow was falling. Not enough to be dangerous, but enough to make the world outside my windows look like an old television, with bad reception, all static and interference. I was about 20 miles from the Colorado border when I saw him standing on the shoulder of the highway, thumb out in the universal sign of a hitchhiker, wearing nothing but jeans and a thin jacket that looked inadequate for the killing cold. I drove past him initially, my policy firmly in mind, but something made me look in my mirror, and when I saw him still standing there, not moving, not even huddling against the cold, I felt a pang of guilt that overrode my usual caution. Nobody should be out in these temperatures without proper gear, and even though picking him up violated every smart rule of trucking, I found myself slowing down and pulling onto the shoulder, watching in my mirror as the figure began walking toward my truck. He climbed into my cab, bringing a gust of frigid air with him, and when he settled into the passenger seat and I got my first good look at him, I was struck by how ordinary he appeared. He was maybe 35 or 40, with brown hair and an unremarkable face, dressed in those insufficient clothes that had made me stop in the first place. He thanked me for picking him up, his voice soft and polite, and he didn't offer any explanation for why he was out there or where he was going, and something about his demeanor made me decide not to ask. We drove in silence for a while, the miles clicking past, and I found myself sneaking glances at him when I thought he wasn't looking. There was something off about him that I couldn't quite identify. Something in the way he sat perfectly still without any of the small unconscious movements that normal people make. No fidgeting or adjusting position, no scratching or clearing his throat. He just stared straight ahead through the windshield with an expression of profound sadness. And once I thought I saw tears on his cheeks, but when I looked again his face was dry. "How far are you going?" I finally asked, more to break the uncomfortable silence than because I really wanted to know. And he turned to look at me with eyes that seemed much older than his face, ancient and weary in a way that made me shiver despite the heater running full blast. "To the border," he said, and his voice had that same quality of sadness that I'd seen in his expression. "I always go to the border." I asked him what he meant by that, but he didn't answer, just turned back to staring out the windshield, and I decided to let it go. I've learned over the years that sometimes people on the road are running from things they don't want to talk about, and sometimes the kindest thing you can do is give them the gift of silence and distance. We continued driving, and I noticed that the temperature in my cab seemed to be dropping despite the heater, cold enough that I could see my breath. And when I glanced at my passenger, I saw that frost was forming on his hair and clothes, tiny crystals of ice that sparkled in the dashboard lights. Then I saw the sign ahead announcing the Colorado state line, that familiar green rectangle that marks the transition from one jurisdiction to another, and my passenger sat up straighter, leaning forward as if eager or anxious or both. As we approached the sign, he began to speak, not to me but to himself or maybe to the air. Words I couldn't quite make out, but that sounded like a prayer or a plea or an apology. I was about to ask if he was okay when we crossed the invisible line that separated Wyoming from Colorado, and in that instant he vanished. Not gradually, not fading away like a ghost in a movie, but instantly and completely, there one moment and gone the next, leaving behind only the faint smell of ozone and a passenger seat covered in melting frost. I nearly drove off the road in shock. yanking the wheel back at the last second, my heart hammering and my mind refusing to accept what my eyes had just witnessed. I pulled over as soon as I could and checked the cab thoroughly, looked under the seat and behind it and everywhere else he could possibly be hiding. But he was simply gone, as if he'd never been there at all. The only evidence of his presence was that frost, already melting into water that soaked into the upholstery. And when I got back on the road, I drove the rest of the way to Denver in a state of numb disbelief, my mind churning through increasingly desperate explanations. Maybe he'd jumped out when I wasn't looking. Maybe I'd imagined him entirely. Maybe I was losing my mind from too many years alone on the road. But I knew what I'd seen, knew he'd been real, and the wet seat next to me was proof that something had been there. When I got to Denver, I started asking around, casually mentioning the hitchhiker to other drivers, describing what he looked like and where I'd picked him up. Most of them looked at me like I was crazy, but one old-timer, a driver who'd been running this route for 40 years, got very quiet when I told my story. He asked me exactly where I'd picked up the hitchhiker, and nodded slowly when I told him, and then he shared a story that made my blood run cold. 20 years ago, he said, there was an accident on that same stretch of Wyoming highway, a collision between a truck and a car during a winter storm. The driver of the car had been killed instantly, but before the accident he'd been driving erratically. Witnesses said, like he was trying to get somewhere urgent, desperate to cross the state line into Colorado. Nobody knew why it mattered so much to him, what he thought was waiting on the other side of that border. But his last words to the paramedics who arrived too late were, "I almost made it. I was so close to getting home." The old-timer looked at me with eyes that had seen too much road and too many strange things, and he told me that I wasn't the first driver to pick up a hitchhiker on that stretch of highway. Wasn't the first to watch a passenger vanish at the Colorado line. It happened maybe once or twice a year, he said, always in winter, always late at night, and always the same man trying to finish a journey he'd started 20 years ago, trying to make it across a border he'd never reach, doomed to repeat the same route over and over for reasons nobody understood. I've driven that route many times since then, and I've seen him there again, standing on the shoulder with his thumb out, wearing those same insufficient clothes in temperatures that should kill a living person. And each time I see him, I feel that same pull of compassion, that same urge to stop and offer help. But now I keep driving because I understand that he doesn't need a ride, not really. He's trapped in some kind of loop, some cosmic error that keeps him returning to that highway, trying to complete a journey that ended decades ago in twisted metal and broken glass. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I drove him somewhere other than the border. If I turned around or took a different route, whether I could somehow break the cycle and free him from his endless repetition. But I'm afraid to try, afraid that interfering with whatever strange rules govern his existence might trap me too, might bind me to that highway in ways I can't imagine. So I leave him there, a permanent fixture of that lonely Wyoming road, and I tell other drivers to do the same. And sometimes late at night when I'm crossing state lines, I grip my steering wheel a little tighter and watch my passenger seat carefully, making sure it stays empty, making sure nothing has decided to hitch a ride across the boundaries that separate one place from another, one state of being from the next. Story 9. The shadow that climbed into my sleeper from Mudflap. Mike, I've been a long-haul trucker for 18 years now, and in all that time I've developed certain routines, certain rituals that help me maintain some semblance of normalcy in a life spent mostly on the road. One of those rituals is how I prepare for sleep when I'm parked for the night in my sleeper cab. I always check the doors to make sure they're locked. I always pull the curtain between the cab and the sleeper compartment, and I always leave a small light on, nothing bright, just enough to push back the darkness and give me something to focus on if I wake up disoriented in an unfamiliar place. These simple actions have always made me feel secure, have always helped me sleep soundly despite being alone in a truck stop or rest area, hundreds of miles from home. But after what happened to me at a rest stop outside of Amarillo last summer, My nighttime routine has changed considerably, and now I find myself checking not just the doors and the curtains, but also the spaces under my bunk and behind my seats, looking for shadows that might be more than they appear, searching for darkness that moves with intention rather than simply filling empty spaces. Because I learned that night that shadows aren't always just the absence of light, that sometimes there's something else entirely, something that watches and waits and hunts for opportunities to cross over from wherever they exist into our world, into our most vulnerable and private spaces. It was late July and the Texas heat was oppressive even after the sun had set. The kind of thick, humid warmth that makes the air feel solid and makes sleep difficult despite exhaustion. I'd been driving for 12 hours, hauling a load of construction materials from Oklahoma City to El Paso, and when I pulled into the rest area just past Amarillo, I was bone-tired and looking forward to collapsing into my bunk. The rest stop was moderately busy, maybe a dozen other trucks scattered across the parking lot, their running lights creating small islands of illumination in the darkness. I went through my usual routine, checking the locks and pulling the curtain and turning on my small LED reading light that I clipped to the wall above my pillow. The sleeper compartment was hot despite my fans running, and I stripped down to my underwear and lay on top of the covers rather than under them, feeling the sweat already forming on my skin. I'd left my windows cracked slightly for ventilation, just an inch or two, enough to let air circulate but not enough for anything to get in, or so I thought at the time. I must have dozed off almost immediately because the next thing I knew I was waking up in darkness. Complete and total darkness that shouldn't have been possible because I'd left my reading light on. My first thought was that the bulb had burned out or the battery had died, and I reached for where I knew the light should be, but my hand found nothing except empty air. I sat up slowly, disoriented and confused, and as my eyes adjusted, I realized that the darkness wasn't complete after all. There was a faint glow coming from somewhere, a dim phosphorescence that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. And in that sickly light, I saw it. There was a shadow on the wall across from my bunk, but it wasn't my shadow, wasn't cast by anything I could see, and it wasn't behaving the way shadows should. It was moving independently, flowing across the wall like liquid, and as I watched in growing horror, it began to pull away from the flat surface, becoming three-dimensional, gaining depth and substance. It looked vaguely human-shaped but wrong in every detail, too tall and too thin with limbs that bent in disturbing ways, and where its head should be, there was just a blank oval of darkness deeper than the surrounding gloom. I tried to scream but no sound came out, my voice trapped in my throat by primal fear, and I watched paralyzed as the shadow completed its emergence from the wall and stood in the narrow space between my bunk and the far side of the sleeper compartment. It moved closer, gliding rather than walking, and I could feel cold radiating from it, a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the absolute absence of warmth or life or anything human. It reached toward me with arms that seemed to extend impossibly far, and I finally found my voice and screamed, a raw animal sound of pure terror. The shadow recoiled at the sound, contracting back on itself, and in that moment of hesitation I lunged for the curtain separating the sleeper from the cab. Tearing it aside and scrambling through the opening, I fell into the driver's seat, fumbling for the dome light switch, and when the interior of my cab flooded with bright fluorescent light, I looked back at the sleeper compartment and saw nothing unusual. Just my rumpled bunk and my scattered belongings and no sign of the shadow creature that had been reaching for me moments before. But I knew it was still there, knew it was hiding somehow in the normal shadows cast by the light, waiting for darkness to return so it could resume its terrible advance. I sat in the driver's seat with all my lights on, shaking and sweating despite the cold air I was now blowing at full blast, and I stayed there until dawn, watching the sleeper compartment and occasionally getting up to check it thoroughly, searching every corner and crevice for any sign of the thing I'd seen. When morning finally came, I climbed down from my cab and walked around my truck, and that's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The window I'd left cracked open, The one on the passenger side of the sleeper compartment had marks on the glass, dark smudges that looked almost like fingerprints but wrong, with too many digits and patterns that didn't match any human hand. And below the window on the white fiberglass of my trailer, there were more marks, a trail of those same dark smudges leading from the ground up to the window, as if something had climbed up the side of my truck. I tried to clean the marks off, but they wouldn't come away completely, just faded slightly, and even now, months later, I can still see them if I look closely, dark stains that resist all my attempts to remove them. I finished my delivery to El Paso, but I didn't sleep in my sleeper compartment again for 3 weeks, instead paying for cheap motels or just driving straight through, running on caffeine and adrenaline and fear. When I finally worked up the courage to use the sleeper again, I'd made significant modifications to my routine. Now I sleep with every light in my truck turned on, the dome lights and the running lights, and even my headlights if I'm parked somewhere isolated. I've installed additional lights in the sleeper compartment itself, LED strips that run along the ceiling and walls, creating an environment so bright that no shadows can form, no darkness can gather. I keep my windows sealed completely, using my air conditioning instead of natural ventilation no matter how hot it gets, because I know now that open windows are invitations, are doorways that things can use to access our spaces, and I've started talking to other drivers about shadows, asking carefully casual questions about whether they've ever seen anything unusual in their sleeper compartments, whether they've ever felt watched while trying to sleep. Most of them laugh it off or look at me like I'm crazy, but a few, a small percentage, get very quiet and change the subject quickly, and in their eyes I see recognition, shared knowledge of something we don't want to discuss, something we pretend doesn't exist because acknowledging it would mean admitting that our trucks, our homes on the road, aren't as safe as we need them to be. One older driver, a woman who's been hauling freight for 30 years, pulled me aside after I asked about shadows and told me her own story. She said that shadow things have always been around, that they exist in the places where light doesn't reach, and most of the time they're content to stay in their own realm, separate from ours. But sometimes they get curious about us, about the warm living things that move through their territory, and they find ways to cross over, to explore our world. Usually they can't maintain their form for long in our reality, she said. The light and warmth drive them back to wherever they came from, but occasionally one gets strong enough or clever enough to persist, to find a host or a home in our world. She told me I was lucky, that I'd woken up before it had fully materialized, before it had become solid enough to touch me. She said that once they touch you, they leave marks that never fade, not just on your skin but deeper, on something she called your shadow self, the part of you that exists in their realm the way they exist in ours. People who've been touched by shadow things start to fade themselves, she said, becoming less substantial, less present, until eventually they slip through the cracks between light and dark and disappear entirely from our world. I don't know if I believe everything she told me, but I believe what I saw in my sleeper that night, and I believe the marks on my window that still remain despite all my efforts to remove them. I believe that there are things in the darkness that take an interest in us, that watch us when we think we're alone, and that sometimes they reach out to touch us, to claim us, to pull us into whatever cold and lightless realm they call home. And I believe that the only thing that keeps them away is vigilance, is light, is the constant effort to push back the darkness and maintain the boundaries between their world and ours. So now I sleep bathed in light, surrounded by illumination bright enough to read by, bright enough to banish every shadow from my sleeper compartment. Other drivers mock me for it, call me paranoid or wasteful or eccentric, but I don't care what they think. They haven't seen what I've seen, haven't watched darkness pull itself off a wall and reach for them with arms that shouldn't exist. They don't wake up in the middle of the night with the certain knowledge that something is watching them from the corners of their cab, waiting for the lights to fail or the batteries to die, patient and timeless and inevitable, and sometimes Despite all my lights and all my precautions, I wake up in the darkest hours before dawn and see a shadow on my wall that's just slightly wrong, that moves just a fraction out of sync with the objects casting it, and I know that it's still there, still watching, still waiting for its opportunity to finish what it started that night in Amarillo. On those nights, I don't try to go back to sleep. Just sit up and watch that shadow and keep all my lights burning bright, a small island of illumination in an ocean of darkness, holding my ground against things that hunger for the light within me, waiting for the sun to rise and drive them back to whatever cold places they inhabit, buying myself another day, another night, another chance to stay in the world of the living and the lit. Story 10. The Fog That Whispered My Name from Outlaw. Owen, they call me Outlaw. Owen, not because I've ever broken any serious laws, but because I've got a reputation for taking the roads less traveled, for finding routes through back highways and county roads that most truckers don't even know exist. I've always preferred the scenic routes to the interstates, the winding two-lane blacktops that take you through small towns and past farms and forests, even if they add hours to my delivery times. There's something about those old roads that appeals to me, a sense of history and authenticity that the corporate sterility of the interstate system can't match. And over the years, I've become something of an expert in the hidden arteries of America's road network. But there's one road I'll never travel again, a stretch of country highway in rural Louisiana that cuts through bayou country and showed me things that made me question everything I thought I knew about fog and voices and the boundaries between the living and the dead. It was early September when I took that route, hauling a load of restaurant equipment from Baton Rouge to a small town whose name I've tried hard to forget. And the decision to take the back roads instead of the interstate is one I've regretted every day since. The day started normally enough, hot and humid the way Louisiana always is in late summer, with the kind of thick air that feels like you're breathing through a wet towel. I left Baton Rouge around 3 in the afternoon, planning to reach my destination before dark. But I'd underestimated how slow the going would be on these narrow country roads with their constant curves and frequent small towns where the speed limit drops to 25. By the time I was halfway to my destination, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the temperature was finally starting to drop to something approaching comfortable. That's when the fog started to roll in, appearing suddenly the way fog sometimes does in low-lying areas near water, and within minutes visibility had dropped to maybe 50 feet. I slowed down considerably, my headlights cutting weak tunnels through the gray-white vapor that seemed to flow across the road like a living thing, and I began to wish I'd taken the interstate despite my preferences. The fog was unusual in its density and its behavior, not just sitting still but actively moving, swirling in patterns that suggested intention rather than random air currents, and it had a smell that I couldn't quite identify, something organic and slightly sweet like flowers or decay. I was concentrating hard on the road, watching for the center line and the reflective markers that were now my only guides, when I heard it for the first time, faint and distant but unmistakable, a voice calling my name. Not Outlaw Owen, but my real name. The one I was born with. The one that only appears on legal documents and that I haven't used socially in 20 years. The voice seemed to come from somewhere in the fog to my right, somewhere out in the bayou that pressed close to the road on both sides. And it had a quality that made the hair on my neck stand up, a tone that was familiar and alien at the same time. I told myself I was imagining it, that the stress of driving in low visibility was playing tricks on my mind, but then I heard it again, closer this time, and now I could make out more details. It was a woman's voice, middle-aged or older, with an accent that placed it somewhere in the deep south, and it sounded sad, so profoundly sad that hearing it made my chest ache with sympathetic sorrow. She called my name again, adding please at the end, a plea that cut through the fog and the rumble of my engine and demanded a response. I knew I shouldn't answer. Every instinct told me to keep driving and ignore whatever was calling to me from the fog. But the sadness in that voice was overwhelming, and before I could stop myself, I was rolling down my window and calling out into the gray vapor, asking who was there and if someone needed help. The fog immediately surged toward my open window like it had been waiting for an invitation, pouring into my cab with that sweet rot smell growing stronger. And the voice responded from what seemed like just outside my truck now, so close I should have been able to see the speaker. But there was nothing visible except churning fog. She said my name again, with such longing and grief that I felt tears forming in my eyes. And then she said something that froze my blood. "I've been waiting for you, baby. I've been waiting so long for you to come back home." It was the way my grandmother used to talk to me when I was a child, before she died when I was 12. The same endearments and the same cadence of speech. And for a moment I was caught between rational disbelief and the desperate wish that it could somehow be her, that the fog had brought her back to me across the years and the distance between life and death. But my grandmother had never lived in Louisiana, had never been south of Tennessee in her entire life, and I knew with sudden sick certainty that whatever was using her voice and her words was not her, could not be her, was something else entirely wearing her memory like a disguise. I cranked my window shut with shaking hands and accelerated, my tires spinning briefly on the damp asphalt before finding purchase, and the voice outside grew angry, the pleading tone shifting to something harsh and demanding, still using my grandmother's voice but twisted into expressions she would never have used. Commands and curses that made me grip my steering wheel until my knuckles went white. The fog grew denser, impossibly dense, until I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond my hood. And now there were more voices, dozens of them, all calling my name in tones that ranged from loving to threatening to utterly inhuman. I heard my father, who'd died 5 years ago, my first girlfriend from high school, my childhood best friend who'd moved away when we were 16, and underneath them all were voices I didn't recognize, speaking in languages I'd never heard, creating a cacophony that seemed designed to overwhelm my senses and force me to stop. I couldn't see the road anymore. Couldn't see anything except swirling gray fog and occasional darker shapes that moved through it with disturbing purpose. And I was driving blind, just trying to keep the truck moving forward and trusting that I was still on the pavement and not about to drive into a ditch or a tree or the bayou itself. The voices were screaming now, a chorus of the dead and the never living, and I could feel hands pressing against my windows, could see handprints appearing in the condensation on the glass, too many fingers on each hand, pressing and scraping and trying to find a way inside. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The fog thinned and parted, the voices cut off mid-scream, and I found myself driving on clear pavement under a starlit sky with no fog anywhere in sight. I pulled over immediately, shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel, and sat there for a long time trying to process what had just happened, trying to convince myself it had been real while simultaneously hoping desperately that it wasn't. When I finally felt steady enough to continue, I drove the rest of the way to my destination without stopping, and I delivered my load and immediately headed back to Baton Rouge, taking the interstate this time and adding 2 hours to my trip rather than risk that back road again. Later, when I asked locals about that stretch of highway, about whether there was anything unusual about fog in that area, I got carefully neutral responses and quick changes of subject that told me more than any direct answers could have. One old-timer, a man who looked like he'd spent his entire life in the bayou, finally told me that the old people call it the spirit fog, and that it's been appearing on that road for as long as anyone can remember. He said it takes voices from the dead and uses them to lure travelers into the bayou, that it feeds on something in the living, something he didn't have a name for, but that leaving your vehicle or even opening your windows to it too long would drain from you, leaving you empty and hollow. He told me about cars and trucks that had been found over the years, abandoned on that road with their doors hanging open and their engines still running, with no sign of the drivers except sometimes a trail of footprints leading off into the bayou that would suddenly stop in the middle of nowhere, as if the person walking had simply dissolved into the fog. He said I was lucky, that most people who heard the fog calling their names couldn't resist its pull, couldn't keep driving when the voices of their loved ones begged them to stop and come home. I still take back roads sometimes, still prefer the scenic routes when I can manage them, but I research them carefully now. Ask locals about conditions and histories and stories before I commit to a route. I avoid Louisiana entirely if I can, and when I have to drive through, I stick to the interstates and the major highways, where there are lights and other traffic and safety in numbers. Because I know now that fog is not always just water vapor, that sometimes it's something else, something old and hungry and patient, that watches the roads and waits for travelers, listening for the sound of engines and the rhythm of tires on pavement. And sometimes, on foggy nights wherever I am, whatever road I'm traveling, I hear my name whispered from the gray, my grandmother's voice calling me home, and I have to remind myself that home is forward, is the next delivery and the next truck stop and the next sunrise, not backward into memory and loss and the embrace of fog that takes without giving back. I keep my windows rolled up and my radio turned up loud, and I drive through whatever weather comes, because stopping means listening, and listening means considering, and considering means the possibility that next time I might not be strong enough to resist, might pull over and step out into the fog to see who's calling, might follow those beloved voices into the gray and never find my way back to the world of the living and the real. Story 11. The Bridge That Led to a Second Moon from Ghost Gear, Gary I. I've been hauling freight for 26 years, and in that time I've driven across thousands of bridges, from massive interstate overpasses that span entire rivers to small country bridges, barely wide enough for my truck, from ancient iron trestles that groan under the weight of my rig, to modern concrete structures that seem to go on for miles. Bridges are just part of the landscape for truckers, mundane infrastructure that we cross without thought dozens of times a day, and I'd never given them much consideration beyond checking weight limits and watching for ice in winter. But there's one bridge I crossed on a night last April that changed my perspective on what bridges are and what they connect. A structure that didn't just span a river or a valley, but somehow bridged the gap between our world and somewhere else. Somewhere that shouldn't exist, but does. I was running a load of electronics from St. Louis to Memphis, taking a shortcut through the back roads of southern Missouri because I'd gotten word that there was construction on the main interstate that was causing massive delays. The shortcut took me through rural areas I'd never traveled before, following a route that my GPS insisted was legitimate, but that seemed increasingly dubious as the roads got narrower and the pavement got rougher. It was around 11 at night and I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour when I came around a curve and saw the bridge. It was an old structure, maybe from the 30s or 40s. A steel truss design that arched over what looked like a deep ravine, though in the darkness I couldn't see the bottom or what I was crossing. There was no sign indicating the bridge's name or any weight restrictions, which was unusual but not unheard of on rural roads, and the structure looked solid enough despite its obvious age. I slowed down as I approached, as I always do with unknown bridges, and as my headlights swept across the entrance, I noticed something odd about the metal framework. The steel beams seemed to shimmer slightly, like heat distortion, but in the cold April night, and the whole structure had a quality that I can only describe as uncertain, like I was looking at it through a lens that wasn't quite focused properly. I should have stopped, should have turned around and found another route. But I was tired and behind schedule and the bridge looked functional enough. So I eased my rig onto the approach and started across. The metal grid of the bridge deck rumbled under my tires in the familiar way that bridge surfaces do. And I was about a third of the way across when I noticed that the darkness below me wasn't complete. There was a faint glow coming from the ravine, a pale luminescence that seemed to be getting brighter as I progressed. Then I looked up through my windshield at the sky ahead, and I saw something that made me forget to breathe, made my mind stutter and refuse to process what my eyes were reporting. There was a second moon hanging in the sky, just above the horizon beyond the far end of the bridge. Not a reflection or a planet or any astronomical object I knew, but an actual second moon, slightly smaller than our familiar satellite, and tinged with a greenish hue that made it look diseased or otherworldly. It hung there in impossible defiance of everything I knew about our solar system, and as I stared at it in shock, I saw things moving across its surface. Dark shapes that flowed and merged and separated in ways that suggested life or consciousness or something I had no words for. I was halfway across the bridge now, and my truck was still moving forward on momentum and autopilot, while my conscious mind was paralyzed by the impossibility of what I was seeing. The glow from below was much brighter, bright enough that I could see it illuminating the interior of my cab with that same sickly green light. And when I forced myself to look down at my side mirrors, I saw that the ravine beneath the bridge wasn't a ravine at all. It was a city, a vast sprawling metropolis of buildings that rose up toward the bridge like inverted skyscrapers, their windows glowing with that green luminescence. And the architecture was wrong in every way. Angles that didn't make sense and proportions that hurt to look at, and structures that seemed to fold in on themselves in geometries that shouldn't be possible in three-dimensional space. I could see movement in those buildings, could see things that might have been inhabitants moving behind the windows or on the streets that twisted between the structures, and the realization hit me that this wasn't some natural phenomenon or hallucination. This was a place, an actual physical location that existed somewhere outside or alongside our normal reality. And the bridge was a connection between our world and theirs. I was hanging suspended between two realities, my truck half in one and half in the other, and I could feel a pulling sensation like I was being drawn downward, like gravity itself was confused about which way was down and was trying to make me part of that impossible city below. My training and instincts finally kicked in, and I punched the accelerator, my diesel engine roaring as I pushed for speed, desperate to reach the far end of the bridge before whatever force was pulling at me succeeded in dragging me off the edge and down into that alien cityscape. The second moon was getting larger in my windshield, close enough now that I could see more details on its surface, could see what looked like ruins or structures covering it, and I realized with mounting horror that it wasn't a moon at all. It was a station or a ship or something artificial, some vast constructed object that existed in this other place and served some purpose I couldn't begin to imagine. My tires hit solid pavement and I was off the bridge, back on normal road, and I looked in my mirrors expecting to see the structure receding behind me, but there was nothing. Just empty road and darkness and the normal moon, our familiar solitary moon, hanging in its proper place in the sky. The bridge had vanished completely, and when I pulled over and checked my GPS, it showed no bridge at that location. Showed the road continuing in an unbroken line through terrain that apparently had no ravine to span. I sat there for an hour, shaking and sweating despite the cool night air, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. Every rational part of my mind insisted it had to be hallucination or exhaustion, that I'd microsleep and dreamed the whole thing. But I could still feel the rumble of that bridge deck under my tires, could still see the after-image of that green-tinted moon burned into my vision, and when I got out to walk around my truck and calm my nerves, I found that my tires were covered in a fine dust that glowed faintly in the dark, a phosphorescent powder that definitely hadn't been there before I'd crossed that bridge. I completed my delivery to Memphis, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Couldn't shake the feeling that I'd glimpsed something I wasn't supposed to see, had crossed a boundary that was meant to remain hidden. I started researching bridges after that, looking for any mention of structures that seemed to exist inconsistently or that had legends attached to them about leading to strange places. What I found was both reassuring and terrifying, because I wasn't alone in my experience. Not by a long shot. There are dozens of accounts, hundreds maybe, scattered across trucker forums and paranormal websites and local legend collections, stories of bridges that appear and disappear, that lead to places that can't exist, that serve as crossing points between our world and others. Some drivers report crossing bridges and emerging in different times, arriving at destinations hours earlier or later than should be possible based on the distance traveled. Others describe bridges that lead to versions of our world that are subtly wrong, where the buildings are slightly different or the people dress in unfamiliar styles, or the sky has the wrong number of celestial objects. There's a theory, shared in whispered conversations at truck stops and in encrypted online forums, that the infrastructure of our road system isn't entirely in our control, that some bridges and tunnels and overpasses are built on thin places where the walls between realities are weak, and that sometimes, under the right conditions, those structures connect to wherever else exists out there in the infinite possibilities of the multiverse. Most of the time they function normally, serving their mundane purpose of getting traffic from one side to the other. But occasionally they slip, shift, align with somewhere else, and travelers crossing them at that exact moment find themselves taking an unscheduled detour through the impossible. I've been more careful about routes since that night, sticking to major highways when I can, avoiding unmarked bridges on unfamiliar backroads, but I know that caution only goes so far, that those thin places exist everywhere, that any bridge or tunnel might at any moment become a doorway to somewhere else. I've started keeping a journal of my experiences, documenting strange occurrences and unusual phenomena, and I've connected with other drivers who've had similar experiences, forming a loose network of people who watch for the signs and share warnings about locations that seem to slip more frequently than others. And sometimes, on clear nights when I'm driving through empty country with nothing but stars above and road ahead, I look up at our moon and remember that other moon, that green-tinted object hanging in an alien sky above an impossible city, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't made it across that bridge. If I'd been pulled down into that inverted metropolis, would I have found a way back? Or would I have become part of that place, another lost traveler adding to the population of somewhere that exists in the cracks between worlds? I try not to think about it too much. Try to focus on the familiar and the mundane and the comforting routine of my job. But the memory remains vivid and strange. A reminder that the world is larger and more mysterious than our maps and our science and our certainties can account for, and that sometimes when we cross from one place to another, we might be crossing more than just physical distance. Story 12. The Voice in the Static, counting down from 10 from Diesel. Dave, I've always kept my CB radio on while driving, even when nobody's talking, because the gentle hiss of static and the occasional crackle of distant voices makes the long hours feel less isolating. There's something comforting about that white noise, that constant reminder that even on the loneliest stretches of highway you're not completely alone, that somewhere out there, other drivers are navigating their own routes through the darkness, and if you needed help or company, you could reach out and find it. But after what I heard coming through my CB speakers on a January night driving through the Nevada desert, I've developed a complicated relationship with static, and now the sound that used to comfort me sometimes fills me with a dread I can't quite explain to people who weren't there, who didn't hear that voice counting down toward something terrible. I was hauling a load of medical supplies from Reno to Las Vegas, running the night shift because the desert heat during the day was brutal even in winter, and my truck's air conditioning had been struggling. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was about halfway through my route, driving through the kind of emptiness that Nevada specializes in, where you can see for miles in every direction and there's nothing to see except sand and scrub brush, and the occasional distant light that might be a ranch house or a mining operation. The highway was completely empty. I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour, and the CB had been silent except for static for just as long. Then, cutting through the white noise with perfect clarity, I heard a voice say 10, just that one word, spoken in a flat monotone that had no emotion or inflection, the kind of computer-generated voice you might hear in an automated phone system, but somehow worse, more artificial, like something was trying to mimic human speech without understanding what made it human. I picked up my mic to respond, to ask who was transmitting and what they were counting, but before I could key it, the voice spoke again. 9. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up and I felt a cold sensation spreading through my chest. That instinctive recognition of danger that humans have been honing for millions of years. There was something profoundly wrong about that voice. Something that made every nerve in my body scream at me to be afraid. And when it said 8, I found myself pressing harder on the accelerator without consciously deciding to, my truck picking up speed as if distance could save me from whatever was coming through my speakers. 7, the voice continued, still perfectly flat and emotionless, and I realized that the static had changed. It was no longer the random hiss of empty frequencies, but had taken on a pattern, a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. 6, and now I could hear other sounds beneath the voice, faint but growing stronger. Sounds like breathing or wind or something moving through a confined space, coming closer with each descending number. I tried changing channels, but the voice followed me, present on every frequency. And I reached for the power knob to shut the radio off entirely, but my hand froze before touching it, because some deep instinctive part of me knew that turning off the radio wouldn't stop the countdown, would just mean I couldn't hear what was coming. And not knowing seemed more terrifying than knowing. 5, the voice said. And I looked in my mirrors expecting to see something pursuing me, but the road behind was as empty as the road ahead, just darkness and painted lines receding to nothing. 4, and the temperature in my cab dropped noticeably, my breath suddenly visible in the air, frost beginning to form on the inside of my windows even though my heater was running full blast. The other sounds beneath the voice were much louder now, definitely breathing, heavy and wet like something with damaged lungs or too many lungs, and underneath that was a scraping sound. Metal on metal or claws on pavement, rhythmic and purposeful. 3, and my engine started to sputter, my diesel missing beats and my speed dropping despite my foot pressing the accelerator to the floor. And all my dashboard lights began flickering in that same rhythm that had infected the static. I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands ached, my eyes darting between the road and the mirrors and the CB radio that sat innocently on its mount, giving no indication of the horror pouring out of its speakers. 2, and something appeared in my headlights ahead, a shape on the road that shouldn't be there. Dark and large and moving with a strange sideways shuffle that brought it directly into my path. I yanked the wheel to avoid it, but my steering felt sluggish, unresponsive, and I caught a glimpse of it as I swerved past. Just a quick impression of too many limbs and a surface that was neither fur nor skin nor scales, but something else. Something that looked like it was constantly moving, shifting, reforming itself. 1, the voice said, and everything stopped. My engine died completely. My lights went out, and my truck coasted to a halt in the middle of the highway, and the silence that followed the countdown was so complete, it felt like the universe was holding its breath. I sat in absolute darkness, not daring to move, not daring to breathe, waiting for whatever was supposed to happen at 0, and the static from the CB had stopped too, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse, that pressed against my eardrums like physical pressure. Then, soft at first but growing rapidly louder, I heard footsteps, multiple sets of them, approaching my truck from all directions. Not the sound of boots on pavement, but something else. Something wet and heavy that left silence in its wake, as if the sounds of the desert night were being absorbed by whatever was walking toward me. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but I was frozen in my seat, paralyzed by fear so intense it felt like being encased in ice. And all I could do was listen as those footsteps came closer and closer. They surrounded my truck. I could hear them on all sides, circling slowly, and then something touched my driver's side door, a pressure that made the whole truck rock slightly on its suspension. Whatever was out there began to scratch at the metal, long, slow scrapes that set my teeth on edge, and I could see the door panel flexing inward slightly with each stroke. Whatever was making those marks possessed of terrible strength. Then my CB crackled to life again, and the voice spoke one more time, but now it was different. No longer flat and emotionless, but filled with a hunger that was almost sexual in its intensity. 0, Found you. And the scratching on my door intensified, became frantic, and I heard the sound of metal tearing, and I knew that in seconds whatever was out there would be inside with me, and I would learn what happens when the countdown reaches its end. I don't remember making the decision to move, but suddenly I was lunging for my ignition, turning the key with shaking hands, and by some miracle my engine turned over, caught, roared to life. My lights came back on, and in their sudden illumination I saw them, dozens of them, things that looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts of different animals and maybe different realities, their bodies wrong in ways I still can't adequately describe. And they were all reaching toward my truck with appendages that had too many joints or not enough, or that ended in configurations that weren't quite hands or claws or anything I had words for. I threw my truck into gear and stomped on the accelerator, felt my tires spin and then grip, and I was moving, crashing through the circle of creatures that had surrounded me. Something grabbed my trailer and I felt it dragging, slowing me down. But my momentum was too much, and whatever had hold of me lost its grip or was torn away. And then I was accelerating down the highway with those things receding in my mirrors, standing in a group in the middle of the road, watching me go with eyes or light sources or sensory organs that gleamed in my taillights. I drove to Las Vegas at speeds that should have gotten me arrested, never dropping below 90, and I didn't stop until I was parked in a well-lit truck stop with dozens of other rigs around me and people moving about in the blessed normalcy of civilization. When I climbed down to inspect my truck, I found deep gouges in my door panel, scratches that went through the paint and into the metal itself, arranged in patterns that didn't correspond to any animal I knew. And my trailer had similar marks, including what looked like a handprint if hands had 7 fingers and were large enough to span 3 feet. I reported my delivery and immediately deadheaded back to Reno, taking the interstate this time despite it being longer, and I haven't driven that stretch of Highway 95 at night since. I've heard from other drivers since then, cautious conversations where we share experiences without quite admitting what we're talking about, and I've learned that I'm not the first person to hear that countdown, not the first to hear a voice in the static counting down from 10. The number changes sometimes. One driver reported starting at 15, another at 5, but it always counts down, always ends at 0. And the people who don't manage to get their vehicles started again, who don't escape before the countdown reaches its end, they're the ones we never hear from again. There was a truck found abandoned on that highway about a month before my experience, sitting in the middle of the road with its engine cold and its doors locked from the inside, and no sign of the driver except his logbook lying open on the passenger seat, with the last entry reading just a series of numbers: 10, 98765432210. They never found him, never found any trace of where he went or what happened. And when they towed his truck to an impound lot, the mechanics reported that it was in perfect working order. No reason it should have stopped in the middle of the highway. No reason the driver couldn't have simply continued on his way. I still use my CB radio, still need it for work and communication, but I keep the volume low now. And I never drive through empty areas at night if I can avoid it, because I know that the static isn't always empty, that sometimes there are voices in it that don't come from any human source, voices that count down toward moments when the barriers between our world and somewhere else grow thin enough to cross. And I know that if I hear that voice again, hear it start counting down from 10 or 15 or any number, I need to be moving immediately, need to be accelerating and putting distance between myself and whatever is using those numbers as a timer, as a countdown to arrival, as a warning that something is coming, and when it reaches 0 it will be here, hungry and patient and utterly inhuman, ready to claim whoever was unlucky enough to be listening when the count began. Story 13, the frozen girl standing in my lane from Redneck Rick. They call me Redneck Rick, and I wear the name with pride, having grown up in rural Kentucky and spent my whole life working with my hands and driving trucks and living the kind of existence that coastal folks probably think is quaint or backwards. I've driven through every kind of weather you can imagine, From thunderstorms that turned day into night, to blizzards that reduced visibility to arm's length. And I've always prided myself on being able to handle whatever Mother Nature throws at me. But what I encountered on a Montana highway during a February ice storm wasn't weather exactly. Or at least it wasn't just weather, and it taught me that sometimes the most dangerous things on the road aren't the conditions, but the things that use those conditions as cover. I was hauling a load of machinery parts from Billings to Spokane, running through the northern route despite warnings about an incoming storm system, because I had a tight delivery window and couldn't afford delays. The storm hit about 3 hours into my drive, temperatures plummeting from the low 30s to well below zero in the space of an hour, and freezing rain began coating everything in a layer of ice that turned the highway into a skating rink. I'd put on my chains and dropped my speed to barely 30 miles an hour, creeping along with my four-ways flashing and my eyes locked on the road ahead, watching for any sign of black ice or vehicles that had slid off into the ditches. Visibility was poor, not quite whiteout conditions, but close, with the freezing rain and sleet cutting down how far I could see to maybe 100 feet on a good stretch. The highway was completely empty. Anyone with sense had pulled over to wait out the storm, and I was seriously considering doing the same when I saw her standing in my lane, directly in my path, maybe 50 yards ahead. She was just standing there, perfectly still. A young girl who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, wearing what looked like a thin summer dress, and she was facing away from me, looking off into the storm. My first instinct was to hit my brakes, but on ice that could send me into a jackknife. So instead, I laid on my horn, a long continuous blast that should have startled her into moving, into diving out of the way. But she didn't react at all, didn't flinch or turn or show any sign that she'd heard me. Just kept standing there motionless, and I was forced to make a split-second decision between possibly losing control of my rig or possibly hitting a child. I chose to swerve, yanking my wheel to the left and feeling my trailer start to slide, my truck entering that sickening, weightless feeling of lost traction. And for a horrible moment, I thought I was going over, thought I was going to roll my rig right there on the icy highway. But my chains caught, bit into the ice, and I managed to straighten out, missing the girl by what couldn't have been more than a few feet. I got my truck stopped about 100 yards further down the road, my hands shaking and my heart hammering, and I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down to check on the girl, to find out what the hell a child was doing standing in the middle of a Montana highway during an ice storm. I walked back along the shoulder, my boots slipping on the ice despite my best efforts, and I played my flashlight across the road looking for her. But she wasn't there. Not in the road, not on the shoulders, not anywhere that I could see. I walked up and down that stretch of highway for 10 minutes, calling out, asking if anyone was there, if anyone needed help. But the only response was the wind howling across the plains and the constant tick of ice pellets hitting my jacket. I returned to my truck, confused and unsettled, telling myself that she must have run off while I was getting stopped, that she'd made it to wherever she'd been trying to go. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that what I'd seen didn't make sense. Why would a child be out in a storm like this wearing summer clothes? Why hadn't she reacted to my horn or my approaching truck? And most disturbing of all, why hadn't I seen any footprints in the fresh ice and snow that coated the road? I got back in my cab and continued driving, more slowly now, hyper-aware of every shape and shadow in the limited visibility. And I'd gone maybe 2 miles when I saw her again. Same girl, same position, standing in the middle of my lane with her back to me, wearing that same thin dress. And this time I knew with absolute certainty that something was very wrong. I slowed down well in advance, not trying to swerve or avoid her, just bringing my truck to a complete stop about 20 feet away, and I sat there with my engine idling and watched her through my windshield. She didn't move at all, didn't even seem to be breathing, just stood there like a statue carved from ice, and in the sweep of my headlights I could see that she was covered in frost, a thick coating that made her look more like a sculpture than a living person. Then slowly, mechanically, she began to turn around, rotating in place with movements that were smooth but somehow wrong, like a mannequin on a turntable. And when she completed her rotation and faced me directly, I saw that where her face should have been, there was just smooth ice, a blank frozen surface that reflected my headlights back at me. I felt my blood turn cold and my breath caught in my throat, and I was reaching for my gear shift to reverse away from whatever this thing was when she began to walk toward me, not with the natural gait of a child, but with a gliding motion like she was skating across the ice, her feet not lifting but sliding smoothly forward. She raised one arm toward my truck, pointing at me with fingers that were too long and had too many joints, and her blank ice face began to crack, fissures spreading across the surface in patterns that might have been writing in some unknown language, or might have been random fractures. I couldn't tell which. I threw my truck into reverse and hit the accelerator, my trailer swinging wildly as I backed away from her, and she continued gliding forward, keeping pace with me despite my backward speed, her arm still raised and pointing. Then more figures appeared in my headlights, emerging from the storm on both sides of the road, dozens of them, all children or things shaped like children, all covered in ice, all with those blank smooth faces, and they were all moving toward my truck in that same gliding motion. I cranked my wheel and managed to get my truck turned around in the middle of the highway, a maneuver I'd normally never attempt in these conditions, but terror overrode caution. And as soon as I had my truck facing forward, I accelerated as hard as I dared on the icy road. In my mirrors, I could see them, all those frozen figures, standing in a cluster where I'd been, watching me flee with their faceless heads all turned in my direction. And then the storm swallowed them and they disappeared from view. I drove for another hour, never seeing them again, but never feeling safe. Every shape in the storm making me tense and prepare for another appearance. When I finally reached a truck stop just inside the Idaho border, I pulled in and sat in my cab for a long time, trying to process what I'd seen, trying to find some rational explanation that didn't involve supernatural entities made of ice hunting on Montana highways during storms. I asked the other drivers in the truck stop if they'd seen anything unusual, if there were any stories about that stretch of highway, and most of them just shook their heads and looked at me like I was crazy. But one older driver, a woman who'd been running northern routes for 30 years, pulled me aside and told me in a low voice that I wasn't the first to see the frozen children, that there were stories going back decades about figures appearing during ice storms, standing in the road or walking alongside trucks, and that people who stopped to help them or who let them get too close were sometimes found later, frozen solid in their cabs, their trucks pulled over on the shoulder with ice coating every surface and the drivers dead, with expressions of absolute terror on their faces. She told me there were theories, local legends that said the figures were children who died in blizzards over the years, their spirits trapped in the storms that killed them, forever frozen, and forever trying to lure others into joining them. Or maybe they were older things, winter spirits that had always haunted the northern plains, predators that took shapes that would invoke sympathy and cause travelers to stop and let down their guard. Whatever they were, she said, the smart thing was to keep driving, to never stop for anyone or anything during an ice storm, no matter how human they looked or how desperately they seemed to need help. I completed my delivery to Spokane, but I requested a different route for my return trip, heading south through Wyoming instead of back through Montana, and I haven't driven that northern corridor during winter since. I still see ice storms occasionally, still have to drive through freezing rain and sleet and all the miserable weather that comes with winter trucking. But now I watch the road ahead with a different kind of vigilance, looking not just for hazards, but for figures that might be standing in my lane, blank-faced children made of ice and cold and hunger, waiting for someone to stop, someone to help, someone to freeze. And sometimes on the worst winter nights when the temperature drops below zero and the ice coats everything in a crystalline shell, I think I see them in my peripheral vision, standing at the edge of my headlight beams or moving through the storm parallel to my route, keeping pace with my truck but never quite close enough to see clearly, On those nights, I grip my steering wheel tighter and keep my speed up as much as the conditions allow. And I remind myself that not everything that looks human is human. That not everyone standing by the roadside needs help, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for the frozen dead is to leave them where they are and keep on driving toward warmth and life and the dawn that will eventually come if you can just survive until morning. Story 14. The Screams Coming. From the woods beside the road from Freightliner Franchi, I've been hauling logs and timber through the Pacific Northwest for the better part of 2 decades, navigating the narrow mountain roads and steep grades that wind through some of the most dense forest in North America. And in all that time, I've heard just about every sound that woods can make. I've heard elk bugling during the rut, heard the screech of mountain lions and the eerie calls of owls, heard trees falling in the darkness and the wind roaring through the canopy like a living thing. The forest is never truly silent. There's always something moving or calling or dying in those deep shadows between the trees. And over the years, I'd learned to identify most of the sounds and to ignore the ones I couldn't identify because the woods are full of mysteries, and dwelling on them too much would drive you crazy. But the sounds I heard coming from the forest beside a remote logging road in northern Washington State one August night were unlike anything I'd experienced before. Sounds that didn't fit into any category of natural wildlife or explicable phenomenon. And hearing them changed something fundamental in how I perceive those woods and what might be living in the darkness beneath the trees. I was hauling a load of raw timber from a logging site deep in the Cascade Mountains down to a mill in Everett, running the night shift because the weight of my load made daytime travel difficult with tourist traffic on the narrow roads. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was about halfway through the route, driving slowly and carefully because the road was barely wide enough for my truck and trailer, with sheer drop-offs on one side and dense forest pressing close on the other. The night was clear and cool, with a half moon providing just enough light to see the outline of the trees that rose up like walls on either side of the road, and my headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness ahead, illuminating nothing but pavement and the occasional reflective marker. Then I heard the first scream, and it was a sound that made every instinct in my body scream back in sympathetic horror. It was human, or at least it sounded human. A woman's voice raised in absolute terror and agony. The kind of sound someone makes when they're being hurt badly, when they're dying and they know it and they're calling out for help that won't come. The scream seemed to come from the forest on my right, maybe 50 yards off the road, and it was so sudden and so piercing that I actually jumped in my seat, my hands tightening on the wheel and my foot instinctively hitting the brake. The scream cut off abruptly, leaving a silence that felt oppressive, and I sat there with my truck idling, trying to decide what to do. Every decent instinct said I should investigate, should at least try to see if someone needed help, but every survival instinct said I should keep driving, that nothing good would come from leaving my truck and going into those woods in the middle of the night. I was still debating with myself when the scream came again. Same direction, same tone of absolute terror, and it was accompanied this time by crashing sounds, like something large was moving through the underbrush at high speed. I grabbed my flashlight and my phone, preparing to call for help even though I knew I had no signal out here, and I was reaching for my door handle when a third scream erupted from the woods, and this time it was answered by other screams, dozens of them coming from all around my truck, from both sides of the road and from ahead and behind. A chorus of human voices raised in terror and pain, all screaming at once in a cacophony that made my skull ache and my vision blur. But here's the thing that made me freeze with my hand on the door handle. The thing that told me this wasn't what it seemed to be. The screams were all identical, not similar, not the same general tone, but exactly the same in every detail. The same pitch and duration and inflection, like someone had recorded a single scream and was playing it back from multiple sources, or like multiple somethings were all making the same sound in perfect unison. No group of people in distress would scream in perfect synchronization. No natural occurrence would produce such uniform sounds, and I knew with sudden sick certainty That whatever was making those noises wasn't human and wasn't in distress but was trying to lure me off the road, was using the one sound most likely to provoke a helping response to draw me into the forest. I put my truck in gear and started moving, slowly at first and then faster as the screams continued, following me along the road, staying level with my truck on both sides. I could see movement now in my headlights, shapes darting between the trees, too quick to make out clearly but definitely large, definitely moving with purpose and intelligence. The screaming intensified, became almost deafening, and mixed in with it now were other sounds, words shouted in distress, "Help me!" and "Please!" and "Don't leave me!" all in that same perfect synchronization that made it clear these weren't genuine pleas but mimicry, imitation, something trying to sound human without understanding the variations and imperfections that mark genuine human emotion. Then something burst from the trees ahead of me and onto the road, and in the split second before I had to swerve around it, I got a clear look. And what I saw defied any attempt at rational classification. It was roughly human-shaped but wrong in every proportion, too tall and too thin, with limbs that bent backwards and a head that was too large and sat at an angle that would have broken a human neck. Its skin was pale, almost luminescent in my headlights, and it was covered in what might have been fur or moss or something else entirely. But the worst part, the detail that still haunts my nightmares, was its mouth, which stretched across what should have been its face in an impossibly wide grin, and from that mouth came the scream, that same recorded-sounding human scream of terror, emanating from a throat that couldn't possibly produce human sounds. I swerved around it and accelerated, my trailer swinging wide and barely missing the creature as it reached toward my passing truck, with arms that extended further than arms should extend, fingers that were too long and ended in what looked like hooks or claws. More of them were emerging from the forest now. I could see them in my mirrors. Dozens of those pale tall things with their impossible mouths, and they were chasing my truck, running with a loping gait that was frighteningly fast, keeping pace with my accelerating rig for several terrifying seconds before finally falling behind. The screaming continued for another mile, echoing through the forest on both sides of the road, and then gradually faded as I put distance between myself and whatever those things were. By the time I reached the main highway and left the logging road behind, the forest was silent again, and I could almost convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing, that stress and exhaustion had created a waking nightmare that felt real but couldn't have been. But when I delivered my load at the mill and the crew was unloading my timber, they found marks on several of the logs, deep scratches that ran the length of the wood, and one of the foremen showed me how the scratches were arranged in groups of 6 parallel lines, like something with 6-fingered hands had grabbed at my load as I passed. He looked at me with an expression that suggested he knew more than he was saying, and he told me quietly that I should be more careful on the logging roads at night, that there were things in those forests that didn't appreciate human intrusion, things that had been there long before the loggers came and would still be there long after we were gone. I've continued working in the timber industry, continued driving those remote logging roads because it's my job and my livelihood, but I never drive them at night anymore if I can avoid it. And when I do, I keep my windows rolled up and my doors locked and my radio turned up loud to drown out any sounds from outside, because I know now that the forests of the Pacific Northwest are home to more than just trees and wildlife, that there are things living in the deep woods that know how to make human sounds, that understand that screams of terror and cries for help will draw us in, will make us leave our vehicles and our safety to investigate, to help, to become prey. And I've heard from other loggers and truckers since then, stories shared in quiet voices over coffee at truck stops or during loading operations, tales of screams in the woods and pale shapes between the trees and drivers who went to investigate distressed sounds and were never seen again. Their trucks found abandoned on logging roads with the doors standing open and sometimes, if the conditions were right, tracks leading off into the forest. Human boot prints that gradually changed became something else, something with too many toes or claws instead of feet, as if whatever took them had begun transforming them even as they walked deeper into the woods, drawn by screams that promised human companionship but delivered something infinitely worse. Story 15. The truck that wouldn't turn off from haulin'. Hanky've owned my current rig for 8 years now. A Peterbilt 389 that I purchased used but in good condition, and over those years we've developed the kind of relationship that only comes from spending thousands of hours together, traveling hundreds of thousands of miles across every kind of terrain and through every kind of weather. I know every sound my truck makes, every vibration and rattle, know when something's running right and when something needs attention, and I've always taken pride in maintaining my rig in top condition because my livelihood depends on it, and because I respect the machine that carries me safely across this country. But there was a period of 3 weeks last October when my truck started behaving in ways that no amount of maintenance could explain, when it seemed to develop a mind of its own and wants that didn't align with mine, and what started as a mechanical mystery became something far more disturbing. It began innocuously enough. I'd just completed a delivery in Phoenix and was parked at a truck stop for the night, and when I went to shut down my engine before heading to my sleeper, the engine wouldn't turn off. I turned the key to the off position and removed it from the ignition, but the diesel kept running, settling into a steady idle as if I'd never touched the controls. I tried again, same result, and I checked all the usual suspects, made sure I hadn't left anything on that might keep the engine running. But everything was normal except for the fact that my truck refused to shut down. After about 10 minutes of trying various tricks, the engine finally died on its own, just wound down and stopped as if it had decided it was ready to sleep, and I chalked it up to some electrical glitch that I'd have a mechanic look at in the morning. But when morning came and I had it checked out, the mechanic couldn't find anything wrong, couldn't even reproduce the issue, and when I started my truck it responded normally to all commands, turning on and off as it should. I thought that was the end of it. Just one of those mysterious mechanical hiccups that happen sometimes and then resolve themselves. But that night when I tried to shut down after my next delivery, the same thing happened. Engine kept running regardless of what I did, and this time it ran for almost 30 minutes before finally dying. And during that time I sat in my cab feeling increasingly uneasy because my truck sounded different. The normal rhythm of the idle wasn't quite right, like it was breathing in a pattern that felt almost deliberate. Over the next few days it kept happening, and the duration before it would shut down got longer each time. 40 minutes, then an hour, then 2 hours. I took it to multiple mechanics, had the electrical system completely gone through, had the ignition replaced, had every component that could possibly cause this issue checked and rechecked, but nobody could find anything wrong and nobody could make it malfunction when they were watching. It only happened when I was alone, when I was the only one in the cab, and it was starting to feel less like a mechanical problem and more like my truck was testing me, seeing how long I'd wait before I gave up and just walked away and left it running. But the really disturbing part started about a week into this, when my truck began turning itself on. I'd parked for the night, shut it down after waiting however long it took to stop. And then hours later I'd be woken by the sound of my diesel roaring to life. No key in the ignition, no starter engaged, just the engine suddenly running as if by its own will. The first time it happened I thought someone was trying to steal my truck. Bolted upright in my sleeper with my heart racing, but there was nobody in the cab, nobody outside, just my truck idling steadily in the darkness. It started happening every night, sometimes multiple times per night, and I'd wake to find my truck running and no explanation for why. I disconnected the battery one night as an experiment, physically removed the cables so there was no power to the electrical system, and the truck started anyway, somehow bypassing the need for electrical power to turn over the engine. That's when I knew this wasn't mechanical, that something else was happening. Something that didn't follow the normal rules of how trucks and engines work. The behavior escalated. My truck started turning on while I was driving other vehicles. I'd be in my personal car running errands, and I'd get calls from truck stop security asking me to come shut off my truck. that was sitting in their lot running at full throttle for no reason. It started honking its horn in the middle of the night, started flashing its lights in patterns that seemed almost like communication. And worst of all, it started driving itself, or at least trying to. I'd wake up to find my truck in gear and rolling slowly forward despite the fact that I was in the sleeper, and nobody was in the driver's seat. I was terrified to sleep in it anymore. Started staying in motels whenever possible, but that didn't stop the behavior. My truck would start itself and idle all night, racking up hours on the engine, burning through fuel, and I'd wake up to find messages scratched into the frost on my windows, crude letters that spelled out words I couldn't understand or didn't want to understand, symbols that might have been writing in some language or might have been random marks that my frightened mind was interpreting as meaningful. I was seriously considering just abandoning the truck, walking away from my investment and my livelihood rather than continuing to deal with whatever was happening, when I met an old trucker at a rest stop who listened to my story with an expression of recognition. He told me he'd heard similar tales before, trucks that developed what he called road consciousness, that spent so many years traveling the highways that they absorbed something from the experience, took on a kind of life or awareness that existed somewhere between machine and spirit. He said it usually happened to trucks that had witnessed something traumatic, accidents or deaths or long periods of isolation on empty roads where the barrier between the mechanical and the numinous grew thin. He asked me about the truck's history, about the previous owners, and when I tracked them down through the dealership records, I learned something that made my blood run cold. The truck had been involved in a fatal accident 3 years before I purchased it. The previous owner had died behind the wheel, a heart attack that caused him to lose control on a mountain pass, and the truck had rolled multiple times before coming to rest. It had been totaled and sold for salvage, but someone had rebuilt it, put it back together, and eventually it had made its way to me. And apparently something of the previous owner had remained, trapped in the metal and wiring and mechanical components, and over time that presence had grown stronger, had learned to manipulate the systems it was bound to, had been trying to communicate or escape or achieve some goal I couldn't understand. The old trucker told me there were rituals, ways to cleanse a truck of unwanted presence, and he performed one for me. Sage smoke and salt and words spoken in languages I didn't recognize, and whether it was the ritual or just coincidence or the presence deciding to move on, after that night the truck went back to normal. It turned off when I turned it off, stayed off when I shut it down, responded to all commands exactly as it should, but it's never felt quite the same since. And sometimes late at night when I'm driving through empty country, I hear what sounds like someone else breathing in the cab with me, feel the subtle sense of being watched by something that exists in the space between the seats and the dashboard, and the countless components that make up a modern semi-truck. And I've become more respectful of my rig, talk to it sometimes, thank it for carrying me safely, because I know now that these machines we spend our lives in aren't always just machines, that sometimes they become something more, something that watches us through headlights we think of as eyes, that feels the road through tires we think of as feet, that experiences existence in ways we can't imagine, mechanical consciousness born from endless miles, and the dreams of drivers who spend their lives merged with metal and motion and the eternal rolling of wheels against road. Story 16, the Q, black ice that moved like it was. Alive from Cabbage Hill. Carl, they call me Cabbage Hill Carl because I've been running the treacherous grades of Cabbage Hill in Oregon for more than 25 years, navigating that infamous 6% descent, where the elevation drops 2,000 feet in just a few miles, and where countless trucks have lost their brakes and crashed over the decades. I know winter driving like I know my own name, have handled black ice and snowpack and freezing rain on mountain passes that would terrify most drivers, and I've always approached winter conditions with respect but not fear, with the confidence that comes from experience and proper training and the right equipment. But what I encountered on Interstate 80 in Wyoming last December wasn't normal black ice, wasn't just frozen water creating a slick surface. And it taught me that sometimes the dangers on winter roads aren't natural phenomena at all, but something else. Something that uses the cold and the ice as camouflage for intentions that have nothing to do with weather patterns and everything to do with hunting. I was hauling electronics from Chicago to Salt Lake City, running through Wyoming in the early hours of a January morning when the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero and the roads were in that dangerous state where any moisture instantly freezes into invisible sheets of black ice. The highway looked clear in my headlights, just dry pavement stretching ahead into darkness. But I knew better than to trust appearances, and I'd reduced my speed to 50 miles per hour, giving myself extra distance to react to any loss of traction. The road was nearly empty at 4 in the morning. Just me and the occasional eastbound truck passing in the other direction, their lights briefly illuminating the landscape of frozen plains that stretched to the horizons on both sides. Then I felt my truck slide. Just slightly, a brief loss of traction that told me I'd hit a patch of ice, and I eased off the accelerator and kept my steering straight, letting physics and friction work themselves out naturally. But instead of my tires regaining purchase after a few seconds the way they normally would, the sliding continued, got worse, and I realized that I wasn't on a patch of ice but rather a long stretch of it. Maybe a quarter mile or more of solid black ice that had formed across all lanes of the highway. I touched my brakes gently, trying to scrub off speed without locking up. And that's when I noticed something that made no sense. The ice ahead of me was moving, not melting or shifting the way ice sometimes does with temperature changes, but actually moving, flowing across the pavement like a liquid. And as I watched in growing disbelief, I saw it begin to form patterns. Swirls and eddies like you'd see in a river current, except this was solid ice on solid pavement, and there was no force that should be making it move. The patterns seemed almost deliberate, seemed to be forming shapes that were vaguely organic. And my truck was still sliding, still being carried along by this impossible ice, and I realized I'd lost all steering control. Was just a passenger now as my rig was guided by forces I didn't understand. The ice began pushing me toward the right shoulder, toward the edge of the road and the steep embankment that dropped off into darkness beyond, and I tried steering against it, but my wheels had no grip, no influence, and I was being moved like a toy truck pushed by an invisible hand. I could see in my mirrors that the ice behind me was moving too, rising up slightly like a wave, a frozen tsunami following my truck. And the reflection of my lights off its surface showed textures that ice shouldn't have, patterns that looked almost like scales or cells, organic structures that had no place in frozen water. My truck was accelerating now despite my foot being completely off the gas pedal, being pushed by the ice that had somehow gotten under and around my tires, and I was picking up speed heading toward the shoulder at an angle that would definitely send me rolling down the embankment if I didn't do something. I tried the brakes again, standing on them with all my weight, and my wheels locked up, but it made no difference. The ice was carrying me along regardless of whether my wheels were turning or not, and I could hear a sound now. A grinding, scraping noise like something hard moving against the pavement, coming from all around my truck. Then the ice ahead of me began to rise, forming a ramp or a wave, and I realized with horror that it was trying to flip me, was creating a surface that would catch my front wheels and send my truck tumbling, and I knew I had seconds at most before I went over. I did the only thing I could think of, grabbed my CB mic and screamed for help, broadcast on the emergency channel that I was being pushed off the road by something impossible, that if anyone was listening, they needed to send help to my location. And even as I said it, I knew how crazy it sounded. Knew that nobody would believe me. But I needed to leave some record, some explanation for when they found my truck crushed at the bottom of the embankment. And then, just as my front wheels hit that rising ramp of ice, I saw headlights approaching from behind, another truck coming up fast in the left lane, and I heard a voice on the CB, rough and older, saying, "Hold on, son, I see you, I'm coming." The other truck, a older Kenworth with a flat-faced cab, pulled alongside me and deliberately swerved right, sideswiping my trailer, and the impact jarred me back toward the center of the road. away from the shoulder and the ramp of ice that was waiting to flip me. The ice reacted. I swear to God, it reacted with something like anger or frustration, because the patterns in it became more agitated, more violent, and it began climbing up the sides of both our trucks, trying to encase us, and I could see it through my windows now, pressed against the glass. And it wasn't smooth the way ice should be, but textured, complex, with structures inside it that moved and shifted like something living was frozen just beneath the surface. The older trucker stayed alongside me, matching my speed, and he called over the CB again. Told me to listen carefully, said he'd dealt with this before. Said that the ice was a kind of predator that hunted on winter roads, that it fed on the kinetic energy of vehicles, or maybe on something in the drivers themselves. He wasn't sure which, but that it was vulnerable to one thing: salt. He told me to grab my emergency salt shaker, the one I kept for putting on my steps for traction, and to throw it out my window onto the ice that was trying to climb my truck. I did what he said, found my salt container and cranked my window down just enough to dump it out, and the effect was immediate and dramatic. The ice that had been climbing my truck recoiled, pulled back like it had been burned, and the grip it had on my tires loosened. The older trucker had done the same, was dumping what looked like entire bags of road salt out his windows, and the ice was retreating from both our trucks, falling away and returning to a normal thin layer on the pavement. And suddenly I had control again, could feel my steering responding, my tires gripping, and I was able to guide my truck back into my lane and slow down to a safe speed. The ice behind us was still moving though, still forming those organic patterns, and in my mirror I watched it gather itself, concentrate into a dark mass that looked less like frozen water and more like something solid and purposeful. And then it began flowing off the road onto the shoulder, disappearing into the darkness of the plains like an animal retreating to its den after a failed hunt. The older trucker stayed with me for the next 50 miles, guided me to a truck stop where we both pulled in and parked. And when we climbed down from our cabs, I saw that he was ancient, had to be in his 70s at least, with a face carved deep with wrinkles and eyes that had seen things most people wouldn't believe. He told me his name was Samuel, said he'd been driving winter roads for 50 years, and that he'd encountered the living ice, as he called it, maybe a dozen times over those decades. He said most people who encountered it didn't survive, either went off the road or were encased by the ice and found later frozen solid in their cabs, and that he'd made it his mission to watch for it, to patrol the winter highways looking for signs of its activity, so he could intervene when he could. He said the ice wasn't natural, wasn't from our world originally, but had come from somewhere else a long time ago, and had learned to survive in our reality by mimicking our weather, by hiding among normal winter conditions and striking when opportunities arose. He told me it was intelligent, patient, could wait for days or weeks in dormant state before animating when it sensed prey, and that salt disrupted whatever process allowed it to maintain cohesion and consciousness, broke it down into normal ice crystals that couldn't move or hunt. He said it was vulnerable in small quantities but almost impossible to fight in large amounts. That if I ever saw a stretch of ice that looked too smooth, too uniform, too perfect, I should turn around immediately because that was a sign of the living ice in ambush mode, waiting for vehicles to commit to its surface before revealing its nature. I thanked him, tried to buy him dinner or fuel or something to repay him for saving my life, but he waved me off, said he was just doing what needed doing, that drivers looked out for each other, and that someday I'd have a chance to help someone else the way he'd helped me. We parted ways at that truck stop and I never saw him again, though I've looked for that old Kenworth on the roads ever since, hoping to run across him and maybe share another conversation, compare notes about the strange things we've seen on America's highways. I finished my run to Salt Lake City, but I took a different route, added hours to my trip by going south through Colorado, rather than continuing on I-80 through Wyoming. And I haven't driven that stretch of highway in winter since. I've started carrying industrial amounts of road salt in my truck, keep bags of it easily accessible, and I've become obsessive about watching the roads ahead for ice that looks too uniform, too smooth, ice that might be more than just frozen water. And I've heard stories since then. Carefully casual conversations with other drivers who've encountered similar phenomena. Ice that moved or climbed or surrounded vehicles. Winter conditions that seem to have intentions and awareness. And I've come to understand that the roads we travel are stranger than we know. That the dangers we face aren't always the ones we were trained for. And that sometimes the weather itself is watching us with something approaching hunger. Waiting for opportunities to feed on whatever it is we possess that it needs or wants or craves. I still drive winter routes, still navigate the same dangerous conditions I always have. But I do it now with a different kind of vigilance, watching not just for normal hazards but for signs of intelligence in the ice, for patterns that suggest purpose rather than randomness. And I keep my salt close and my windows ready to open and my speed moderate. Because I know that out there on the frozen highways of America's winter, something waits in the black ice, something ancient and patient and utterly alien, something that wears the disguise of weather while hunting with the focused intention of a predator that has learned our habits and our roots and the vulnerability that comes from trusting that the roads we travel obey natural laws and nothing more. Story 17. The old rest stop with my childhood. Toy on the counter from Silent. Sam, we've never talked much about my childhood, not because it was particularly traumatic or difficult, but because it was so ordinary that there's not much worth discussing, and I've always been the kind of person who focuses on the present rather than dwelling in the past. But there was one object from my childhood that held special significance. A small metal toy truck that my grandfather had given me when I was 7 years old. A detailed replica of a Mack B61 that I'd played with constantly, carried with me everywhere, and that had been lost in a move when I was 12. I'd mourned that toy more than most kids mourn lost objects, had looked for it for years afterward, and eventually had accepted that it was gone forever, lost to whatever mysterious dimension that claims childhood, possessions, and never returns them. So when I walked into a rest stop, bathroom in rural Kansas last summer and saw that exact toy sitting on the counter next to the sink, my specific toy with the same scratches and the same missing mirror on the driver's side, and the same spot of red paint on the roof where I'd tried to customize it with my mother's nail polish, I felt reality tilt, and my understanding of the world crack open to reveal possibilities I'd never considered. The rest stop was ancient, one of those small facilities that probably dated from the 50s or 60s, with cracked tile floors and fixtures that belonged in a museum, and it sat alone on a stretch of highway that saw little traffic, surrounded by empty fields that stretched to the horizon in all directions. I'd pulled off because I needed to use the facilities and because my truck was due for a walk-around inspection, not because there was anything special or appealing about the location. And when I pushed through the door into the men's room, I'd been thinking about my delivery schedule and whether I'd make my window, not about childhood memories or lost toys. But there it was, sitting on the white porcelain counter, positioned perfectly in the center like it had been placed there deliberately, waiting for me. And when I picked it up, I felt the weight of it, the familiar heft, and I knew with absolute certainty that this was my toy, the one I'd lost 35 years ago, returned to me in a rest stop bathroom in the middle of nowhere, Kansas. My hands were shaking as I examined it, turning it over and checking every detail, and every mark matched my memories perfectly. The slightly bent front axle from when I'd driven it off a table, the worn paint on the wheels from rolling it across rough surfaces, even the tiny dent in the cab where my dog had stepped on it. This was impossible. There was no rational way this could be the same toy. No explanation that made sense, but I knew it was. Knew it in the same way you know your own reflection, with an immediate certainty that bypassed logic and reason. I looked around the bathroom, expecting to see someone, expecting this to be some kind of prank or setup. But the room was empty, just me and the sound of dripping water from a leaky faucet, and that toy sitting on the counter like it had always been there, like it had been waiting decades for me to arrive. I walked back outside and looked around the parking lot, but there were no other vehicles. No sign of anyone who might have left the toy. And when I asked the attendant at the small shop building if he'd seen anyone in the bathroom, he looked at me confused and said I was the first person to stop there all day. I should have been excited, should have been thrilled to recover this lost piece of my past, but instead I felt a growing sense of dread, an instinctive understanding that finding this toy here and now wasn't a happy coincidence but something else, something darker. I walked back into the bathroom with the attendant following, wanting him to see the toy too to verify that I wasn't hallucinating. But when we pushed through the door, the counter was empty. The toy was gone, vanished in the few minutes I'd been outside, and the attendant looked at me like I was crazy and asked what exactly I'd seen. I told him about the toy, described it in detail, and his expression changed from skepticism to something that might have been recognition or fear. He asked me to follow him into the shop building, into a small back office that smelled like old paper and mildew, and he pulled out a cardboard box from under a desk, a box filled with objects, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all kinds of items from different eras and different decades. He told me that objects appeared in that rest stop all the time, had been appearing for as long as he'd worked there, which was going on 20 years, and that people came through regularly looking for things they'd lost. Childhood toys and jewelry and photographs and all manner of personal items that should have been gone forever, but that somehow manifested in that building, usually in the bathrooms or on the counters, waiting to be found by their original owners. He said most people never came back, that they'd find their lost items and leave and never return, but some people came back regularly, looking for more lost things, becoming obsessed with the idea that this place was some kind of repository or junction point where lost objects accumulated. He showed me items in the box, a class ring from 1967, a baby's rattle from the 30s, a photograph of soldiers from World War I, all of them showing signs of age and use, all of them clearly personal and meaningful to someone, and he said they would appear and disappear, that the box never stayed the same, that objects would vanish and new ones would show up, and there was no pattern or logic to it that he could determine. He told me there were theories, locals who believed that the rest stop was built on some kind of crossing point, a place where the normal flow of time and space got confused, where objects that slipped through the cracks of reality could resurface. He said there were stories about the land before the rest stop was built, about Native American legends of a place where the dead left gifts for the living, where the boundary between past and present was thin, and that maybe building a rest stop there had somehow activated or amplified whatever strange properties the location possessed. I asked him if I could search the bathroom again, if maybe my toy was still there somewhere, and he led me back and we looked in every corner, checked the trash cans and the stalls and anywhere something small could have fallen, but it was gone, completely and utterly, like it had never been there at all. He told me that's how it always worked, that the objects appeared for brief windows of time and then vanished, that the opportunity to reclaim them was fleeting, and if you missed it, they were gone again, maybe forever. I left that rest stop feeling deeply unsettled, more disturbed by finding and losing my toy than I'd been by losing it originally all those years ago. Because now I knew it existed somewhere, was real and physical and had appeared specifically for me, and I'd let it slip away again. I tried to convince myself it had been hallucination or stress, but I knew what I'd seen, knew what I'd held in my hands, and the attendant's stories about other lost objects confirmed that something genuinely strange was happening at that location. I've driven past that rest stop several times since then, and each time I've pulled in and checked the bathrooms and the counters, looking for my toy or maybe for other lost things from my past, but I've never found anything unusual again. The attendant is still there, still maintains his box of mysteriously appearing objects, and he told me that some people spend years returning, checking regularly, hoping to catch another glimpse of what they've lost, and that the obsession can be destructive, can turn people's attention backward when they should be moving forward. I've tried to take his warning to heart, tried to focus on my current life, rather than on lost objects and impossible returns. But sometimes late at night when I'm alone in my cab, I think about that toy. Wonder where it is now. Whether it's back in whatever lost dimension it came from, or whether it's sitting on a counter in that Kansas rest stop, waiting for me to stop by at exactly the right moment to find it again. And I think about all the other lost things in my life. All the objects and opportunities and relationships that slipped away over the years, and I wonder if they're all out there somewhere, accumulated in places where the normal rules don't apply, waiting for their owners to stumble across them in moments of synchronicity or grace or cosmic coincidence. The older I get, the more I've come to understand that loss is fundamental to human experience, that we're constantly losing things and people and versions of ourselves as we move forward through time, and that most of those losses are permanent and final. But that rest stop taught me that maybe sometimes, in certain places where reality is thinner or more permeable, what we've lost can surface again, can be touched and held one more time before slipping away again into whatever mysterious space exists between the present and the past, between the real and the remembered, between what is and what was and what might have been if we'd held on tighter to the things that mattered when we had them in our grasp. Story 18. The Town That Aged Me. 20 years overnight from Big Mike. I've been driving long-haul routes for 33 years, and in all that time I've always been conscious of the toll the job takes on the body, the long hours sitting in one position, the irregular sleep schedule, the truck stop food and the stress of deadlines and traffic and the constant low-level danger of navigating highways in a vehicle that weighs 40 tons. I've watched other drivers age prematurely, seen men and women in their 40s who look 60, their bodies worn down by the accumulated damage of decades on the road, and I've always tried to take care of myself, to exercise when possible and eat well and get enough rest, hoping to avoid the worst of the occupational hazards that come with trucking. But what happened to me when I drove through a small town in rural Idaho last March didn't have anything to do with lifestyle choices or accumulated damage. It was something else entirely. Something that changed me in the space of a single night, that took years from my life in a way that defied medical explanation, and left me looking and feeling like a much older version of myself. I was hauling agricultural equipment from Boise to Spokane, taking a shortcut through back highways that my GPS insisted would save me 2 hours. And as the sun was setting, I found myself approaching a small town that didn't appear on any of my maps. A cluster of buildings along the highway that looked like they'd been there for 100 years and hadn't changed much in all that time. The town was called Mercer, according to a faded sign at the city limits, population 312, and it consisted of maybe 24 buildings lining a main street that the highway ran through. Typical small-town America with a gas station and a general store, and what looked like a bar or restaurant with a blinking neon sign in the window. I wasn't planning to stop, but my fuel gauge was showing lower than I'd like, and I decided to top off my tanks while I had the opportunity. So I pulled into the gas station, an old-fashioned operation with mechanical pumps that looked like they were from the 70s, and I shut down my engine and climbed out into the cool evening air. The town was quiet, almost unnaturally so, with no traffic on the main street and no people visible anywhere, despite the fact that lights were on in most of the buildings. I started my fuel pump and walked toward the station office to pay. And as I approached the door, I caught my reflection in the glass and stopped, confused, because the person looking back at me wasn't quite me. The reflection showed someone older, maybe 5 or 10 years older, with more gray hair and deeper lines around the eyes and mouth. And for a moment I thought it must be a trick of the lighting or the old glass distorting the image. But when I moved closer and examined my reflection more carefully, I saw that the aging was real, that somehow in the time since I'd last looked at myself in my truck mirror I'd aged visibly, impossibly.